Number 1. Dennis Rader, the church president who spent decades as America's most feared serial killer. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 brothers raised in a working-class household where discipline was strict and expectations were clear. From the outside, Rader appeared to be exactly the kind of man small-town America holds up as a model citizen. He was a husband, a father of 2 children, a faithful member of Christ Lutheran Church where he served as president of the Congregation Council, a compliance officer for the city of Park City who cited residents for code violations, and a Boy Scout leader who helped guide young people toward structure and responsibility. He held a degree in administration of justice from Wichita State University. He went to church on Sundays. He coached his children's activities. He waved to his neighbors. He mowed his lawn. For more than 30 years, the people of Wichita, Kansas, knew Dennis Rader as a slightly rigid, perhaps overly authoritarian, but fundamentally ordinary man embedded in the fabric of their community. What they did not know, what no one around him suspected for 3 full decades, was that Dennis Rader was BTK, the serial killer who had terrorized Wichita since 1974, a man who had strangled 10 people to death with his bare hands and with ligatures, who had written taunting letters to police and newspapers bragging about his crimes, who had invented his own nickname from the method he used to destroy his victims, bind, torture, kill, and who had managed to live among ordinary people, raising a family and serving his church, while carrying the weight of 10 murders and the secret hunger for more. The story of Dennis Rader is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is the story of how completely evil can disguise itself inside the ordinary, how a monster can wear the face of a neighbor for decades without ever being seen, and how one man's pathological need for recognition ultimately destroyed the only armor that had protected him for 30 years. The psychological roots of Rader's violence stretched back to his childhood, though the full picture only emerged after his arrest when investigators and forensic psychologists spent hundreds of hours examining his life. Rader himself described experiencing violent sexual fantasies from a very early age, fantasies that fused domination, bondage, and death into a single compulsive drive that he could neither understand nor suppress. He collected images of bound women. He created what he later called Factor X, his own term for the dark internal force he claimed he could not control, a convenient self-mythology that forensic experts largely rejected as an attempt to externalize responsibility for choices that were entirely his own. As a teenager and young adult, Rader experimented with peeping, voyeurism, and the theft of women's undergarments, behaviors that escalated in intensity as he grew older and found that the fantasies demanded more concrete expression. He served in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970, was stationed at various bases, and returned to Kansas without any criminal record, without any flag in the system, without any indication to anyone around him that he was a man building toward violence. He married Paula Dietz in 1971. They settled into domestic life. And 3 years later, in January of 1974, Dennis Rader committed his first murders, and the BTK killer was born. On January 15, 1974, Rader drove to a house at 803 North Edgemoor Street in Wichita and cut the telephone line before entering. Inside lived the Otero family, Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and their 5 children. Rader had selected them through a process he later described as hunting, surveilling potential victims over time before choosing the moment to strike. That morning, Joseph Otero, 38 years old, a former Air Force pilot originally from Puerto Rico, was home with his wife and 2 of their younger children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine, while the older children had already left for school. Rader entered the home, confronted the family at gunpoint, and bound them. He told them he was only there to take food in their car, that he would not hurt them, a lie he used to maintain control while he prepared what he had actually come to do. He strangled Joseph Sr. with a cord. He strangled Julie with a cord. He strangled young Joseph Jr. by placing a plastic bag over his head. And then he took Josephine to the basement, where he hanged her from a pipe, a deliberate and prolonged act that reflected the specific nature of his fantasies. He later returned to the crime scene after the murders to further engage with what he had done, an act of post-offense behavior that forensic investigators would later identify as a signature element of his psychological profile. Wichita woke up to the news of 4 members of a single family murdered in their home, and law enforcement had no leads, no suspects, no understanding of what they were dealing with. The city was frightened, but it did not yet know that the man responsible was already back in his normal life, going to work, going home to his wife, attending church, and thinking about who he would target next. Rader killed again in April 1974, just 3 months after the Otero murders, when he broke into the home of 21-year-old Catherine Bright and waited inside. When Catherine arrived home with her brother Kevin, Rader confronted them both. He tied Kevin up and attempted to strangle him twice, but Kevin fought back with extraordinary determination and managed to survive despite being shot twice by Rader, a survival that would later prove critically important to the investigation. Catherine was not as fortunate. Rader stabbed her multiple times. She died from her wounds. Kevin Bright staggered out of the house and managed to flag down a passing vehicle, becoming the only person ever to encounter Dennis Rader during a murder and live to identify him. The problem was that Kevin's description, while genuine, was not specific enough in those early years to generate an arrest, and Rader remained free. After the Bright murder, Rader went quiet for 3 years, a period during which he was building his domestic life, finishing his degree, and managing the internal escalation of his fantasies without committing another murder, though investigators later learned he had attempted other attacks that did not succeed. In 1977 he killed again. Shirley Vian, 24 years old, was murdered in her home in March of that year while her young children were locked in a bathroom nearby. Just 9 months later, in December 1977, Rader killed Nancy Fox, 25 years old, breaking into her home and strangling her, then calling the police himself from a pay phone afterward to report the body, a call that was recorded and would later become one of the most analyzed pieces of audio evidence in the case. It was after the Fox murder that Rader made the first of his communications to the public, the letters and packages sent to news organizations and police that would define his relationship with the city of Wichita for the next 3 decades. In a letter sent to Cake TV in October 1974, Rader had already introduced himself and his chosen name, asking the media to call him BTK and providing details about the Otero murders that only the killer could have known, details that confirmed to investigators they were dealing with the same person responsible for all 4 deaths on Edgemore Street. Over the following years, Rader sent poems, letters, and packages that described his crimes in detail, mocked the police investigation, and demanded attention and recognition. He sent a poem about Shirley Vian. He sent a letter after Nancy Fox's death. He was communicating with an audience he believed could never find him, taunting the very system he worked within as a compliance officer who interacted with law enforcement regularly. The Wichita Police Department established a dedicated BTK task force. The FBI's behavioral science unit analyzed the letters and developed a profile of the likely offender. Local newspapers published the communications, the community lived in genuine fear, and Dennis Rader watched all of it from inside his church, his office, his family home, quietly gratified by the chaos his secret self was generating while his public self remained untouched. Between 1979 and 1985, Rader committed 4 more murders. In April 1979, he targeted Anna Williams, an older woman he had been surveilling, but she was not home when he broke in, and he left without killing anyone, instead later sending her a poem about how close she had come to death, a communication that devastated the woman who received it and understood exactly what it meant. In 1985, he killed Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, who lived just a few houses away from Rader himself on the same street, a fact so audacious it seems almost impossible to comprehend. He strangled her in her home, transported her body, and posed it before disposing of it in a ditch. In September 1986, he murdered Vicki Wegerle, 28 years old, gaining entry to her home by posing as a telephone repairman, strangling her, and leaving before her husband returned home. Vicki's husband was initially considered a suspect by investigators, a devastating misidentification that haunted the family for years until Rader was finally caught and the truth emerged. In January 1991, Rader committed his 10th and final murder, killing Dolores Davis, 62 years old, breaking into her home, strangling her, and disposing of her body under a bridge. After Dolores Davis, Rader went silent for more than a decade. He did not kill again. He did not communicate with police or media. He simply lived his life, became president of his church council, continued his work as a compliance officer, and waited, though for what exactly remained unclear even to investigators who analyzed his psychology after his arrest. The silence lasted until 2004, when Rader, apparently motivated by the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders and the publication of a book about the BTK case that he felt did not give him sufficient credit, began communicating again. He sent a package to Cake TV in January 2004 that contained a photocopy of Vicky Wegerle's driver's license and photographs taken at the crime scene, photographs only the killer could have possessed, photographs that immediately and conclusively reopened the BTK investigation with full force. The Wichita Police Department, the FBI, and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation mobilized significant resources. Over the following months, Rader sent a series of increasingly frequent communications, letters, packages, and even a cereal box containing evidence connected to his crimes, totaling 11 separate communications between 2004 and his arrest in February 2005. Investigators studied every piece of material he sent, looking for DNA, fingerprints, postmarks, paper types, anything that could lead them to the sender. The BTK task force grew to dozens of investigators working across multiple agencies. The city of Wichita was once again gripped by fear and fascination, aware that the killer from 30 years earlier was apparently still alive, still in contact, and potentially still dangerous. The break in the case came through Rader's own catastrophic miscalculation. In February 2005, Rader sent investigators a floppy disk inside a purple cereal box. The disk contained a document, and metadata embedded in the file revealed that it had been created on a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church and last modified by a user named Dennis. Investigators cross-referenced this information with a tip that had come in about a man named Dennis Rader who was president of the Christ Lutheran Church Council and had previously attracted attention for his controlling behavior in the community. They ran a covert DNA test, obtaining a DNA sample from a pap smear performed on Rader's daughter Carrie at a Kansas State University health clinic, comparing it to DNA recovered from crime scenes, and confirming a familial match that placed Dennis Rader's genetics at the murders. On February 25, 2005, law enforcement officers pulled Rader over in his vehicle near his home in Park City. He was arrested without incident. He seemed almost calm. Inside his vehicle, investigators found materials that confirmed what the DNA had already told them. Dennis Rader, 60 years old, church president, compliance officer, father, husband, Boy Scout leader, was BTK. The interrogations that followed Rader's arrest were among the most extensively analyzed in American law enforcement history. Rader was cooperative to a degree that disturbed investigators, not because he was remorseful, but because he was eager to discuss his crimes in detail, to explain his methodology, to describe his victims and what he had done to them with a clinical detachment that made clear he viewed his murders as achievements rather than atrocities. He used the term projects to describe his killings. He referred to his victims by letter designations. He described planning, stalking, and executing his attacks with a precision that suggested he had replayed these events in his mind thousands of times over the decades. Forensic psychologists who examined him concluded that Rader met the diagnostic criteria for sexual sadism and narcissistic personality disorder, and that the double life he had maintained for 30 years was not a sign of extraordinary psychological compartmentalization so much as a reflection of his genuine belief that his public self and his private self were both authentic, both real, and both deserving of recognition. He had not been hiding who he was, in his own mind. He had simply been living two simultaneous lives that he saw as equally valid expressions of his identity. Dennis Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Kansas had reinstated the death penalty in 1994, but because Rader's crimes had been committed before that date, he was not eligible for execution. On August 18, 2005, Rader stood in a Sedgwick County courtroom and pleaded guilty to all 10 counts. The sentencing hearing that followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in modern American criminal justice, as relatives of his victims delivered statements directly to the man who had destroyed their families, while Rader sat and listened with an expression that witnesses described as somewhere between boredom and mild interest. Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life terms, with a mandatory minimum of 40 years served before any possibility of parole consideration, a sentence that effectively guaranteed he would die in prison. He was transported to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today, now in his late 70s, his appeals exhausted, his letters to the outside world monitored, his church council presidency a historical footnote in one of the most disturbing true crime cases in American history. Paula Rader filed for divorce immediately after his arrest and was granted it within 60 days on an emergency basis, a legal process that was expedited given the extraordinary circumstances. His children spoke publicly about the devastation of learning what their father truly was. The Congregation of Christ Lutheran Church, the community he had led in worship while hiding the truth of what he had done, struggled for years with the trauma of having trusted and followed a man capable of such profound and sustained evil. The legacy of the BTK case extends far beyond Wichita, Kansas. It transformed the way law enforcement agencies approach cold cases, leading to the widespread adoption of DNA familial matching techniques that have since been used to solve dozens of other cold cases across the United States. It contributed to a fundamental shift in how behavioral analysts understood the capacity of organized, socially integrated individuals to sustain violent criminal behavior over extended periods without detection. The case demolished the persistent cultural assumption that serial killers are visibly disturbed, socially isolated, obviously threatening individuals who cannot function within normal social structures. Dennis Rader functioned extraordinarily well within normal social structures. He held positions of authority. He was trusted by his community. He was elected by his congregation. He cited people for code violations while secretly violating every moral and legal code that human civilization has constructed. The BTK case forced investigators, psychologists, and the broader public to confront a truth that remains profoundly uncomfortable, that evil does not always announce itself, that it can live next door for 30 years, attend your church, knock on your door with a clipboard, and smile at you over the back fence, and you will never know. Dennis Rader knew this better than anyone. He counted on it. And for 30 years, he was right. Number 2, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who buried his victims beneath the house where his neighbors came to dinner. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children raised in a working-class Polish-American household on the northwest side of the city. His father, John Wayne Gacy Sr., was a machinist and a veteran of World War I, a man described by those who knew him as emotionally cold, frequently abusive, and chronically disappointed in his son, whom he openly called a sissy and a mama's boy in front of family and friends. His mother, Marion, was by most accounts warm and nurturing, deeply devoted to her children, and largely powerless to counteract the psychological damage her husband inflicted on their son through years of verbal humiliation and physical punishment. Gacy grew up believing he was a failure in his father's eyes, a belief that psychologists who later examined him concluded had created a deep reservoir of shame, rage, and a desperate hunger for external validation that would shape the entire trajectory of his adult life. As a child, he suffered from a heart condition that kept him out of school for extended periods and prevented him from participating in sports, further isolating him from his peers and deepening the sense that he was fundamentally different, fundamentally lesser, than the boys around him. He was never formally diagnosed with any psychiatric condition during his childhood, never flagged by any teacher or physician as a child in crisis, never removed from an environment that was quietly and consistently breaking something essential inside him. He was simply a quiet, heavy boy from a difficult home on the northwest side of Chicago, and no one looked closely enough to see what was forming beneath the surface. As a young adult, Gacy appeared to many observers to be overcoming the disadvantages of his childhood through sheer force of ambition and social energy. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, in his early 20s and worked as a management trainee for a shoe company, where he proved to be an exceptionally gifted salesman with a natural ability to read people, build rapport quickly, and make strangers feel comfortable and valued in his presence. He joined the Springfield JCs, a civic organization for young men focused on community service and professional development, and threw himself into the organization's activities with an intensity that impressed his peers and quickly elevated him to positions of leadership. He married Marlyn Myers in 1964, and the couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, where Gacy managed a series of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. In Waterloo, he replicated the social pattern he had established in Springfield, joining the local JC's chapter, rising through its ranks, hosting elaborate dinner parties at the couple's home, and cultivating a public reputation as a generous, energetic, community-minded young businessman who seemed destined for success. He was named the JC's Man of the Year in Waterloo. He shook hands with politicians. He organized charity events. He coached youth activities. And he was, simultaneously, secretly assaulting young men and boys, a pattern of predatory behavior that had begun quietly and was already moving toward violence beneath the surface of the life everyone around him could see. In 1968, the first architecture of Gacy's double life collapsed when he was indicted in Black Hawk County, Iowa, on a charge of sodomy against a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees, the son of a fellow JC's member whom Gacy had cultivated a relationship with over time before assaulting him. The investigation that followed the initial charge revealed additional victims and a pattern of behavior that investigators characterized as predatory and deliberate. Gacy hired a man to assault Voorhees in an attempt to intimidate him into recanting his testimony, a move that added additional charges and deepened the legal jeopardy Gacy faced. He pleaded guilty to the sodomy charge in November 1968 and was sentenced to 10 years at the Iowa State Men's Reformatory at Anamosa, a sentence that seemed, at the time, to represent the end of John Wayne Gacy's carefully constructed respectable life. His wife Marlyn divorced him while he was incarcerated, taking their 2 children and severing all connection to the man she had believed she married. His father, John Sr., died in 1969 without reconciling with his son, a fact that Gacy later described as one of the most painful events of his life, the permanent closure of the possibility of ever earning the approval he had spent his entire existence desperately seeking. Gacy was a model prisoner at Anamosa, cooperative with staff, active in programs, and so thoroughly compliant with institutional expectations that he was released on parole after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. He was 28 years old when he walked out of Anamosa in June 1970, and he moved back to Chicago to live with his mother, his Iowa conviction apparently behind him, his future apparently still open. It was not behind him. It was only beginning. Back in Chicago, Gacy rebuilt with extraordinary speed. He worked construction jobs, saved money, and by 1971 had purchased a modest ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in the Norwood Park Township neighborhood of unincorporated Cook County, a quiet, tree-lined suburban street where neighbors kept their lawns tidy and left their doors unlocked. He married Carol Hoff in 1972, a divorced mother of 2 daughters whom he had known before his Iowa conviction, and the blended family settled into the Summerdale Avenue house. Gacy started his own construction contracting business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in remodeling and repair work for commercial properties. The business grew rapidly, driven by Gacy's relentless energy and his genuine skill at managing projects and charming clients. He hired young men, many of them teenagers, to work as laborers on his construction crews, paying them in cash and developing personal relationships with them that extended beyond the worksite. He became, once again, a pillar of the local community, throwing elaborate neighborhood parties that drew dozens of guests, sponsoring local Democratic Party events, and developing a fondness for performing as Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown at children's hospitals, birthday parties, and community fundraisers, painting his own face, sewing his own costumes, and performing magic tricks and balloon animals for delighted audiences who saw in him exactly what he wanted them to see, a big, jovial, generous man who loved making people happy. He was photographed shaking hands with Rosalind Carter, wife of President Jimmy Carter, during a Democratic Party event in 1978, a photograph that would later become one of the most iconic images associated with his case, the smiling killer standing beside the First Lady while his victims were already buried beneath his house. The murders began in 1972, the year after Gacy moved into the Somerdale Avenue house, though the exact timeline of his earliest killings remained uncertain even after his arrest because Gacy's own account of his crimes was inconsistent and investigators were never able to fully verify every detail he provided. The first confirmed victim was Timothy McCoy, a 15-year-old boy from Michigan who was passing through Chicago on a Greyhound bus trip in January 1972. Gacy picked McCoy up near the bus station, brought him back to Somerdale Avenue, and killed him the following morning in a manner Gacy later described to investigators in clinical, emotionless detail. He buried McCoy's body in the crawl space beneath his house, a shallow earthen area roughly 3 feet high that ran beneath the entire footprint of the ranch-style building, accessible through a trapdoor in the floor of the utility room. Over the following 6 years, that crawl space would become the burial ground of 26 of Gacy's 33 confirmed victims, a space that his wife walked over every day, that his neighbors' children played above during the parties Gacy hosted in the house above, a space that held the remains of young men and boys whose families were searching for them while Gacy entertained guests with cocktails and steaks 30 inches above their bodies. Gacy's victims were predominantly young men between the ages of 14 and 21, many of them runaways, hustlers, or young workers he recruited through his construction business or encountered at locations in Chicago where vulnerable young men congregated. He used a variety of methods to lure them to Somerdale Avenue, including offers of work, offers of alcohol, and a manipulation technique he called the rope trick, in which he offered to show victims a magic trick involving a rope or handcuff that, once demonstrated, left the victim restrained and helpless. Once a victim was incapacitated, Gacy would torture and then strangle them, typically using a tourniquet method with a rope and a stick that allowed him to control the level of pressure over an extended period. He buried most victims in the crawl space, though as the space filled he began burying some victims in other locations on his property and eventually disposed of the final 4 victims by throwing their bodies off a bridge into the Des Plaines River, a shift in method that investigators later understood as evidence that he was running out of burial space beneath the house. Carol Hoff, Gacy's second wife, later told investigators that she had noticed a persistent foul smell coming from the area of the house near the crawl space during the mid-1970s and had mentioned it to Gacy, who told her it was caused by moisture and settling soil. She believed him. She had no reason not to. He was her husband, the man who dressed as a clown for sick children, the man whose neighbors loved him, the man who had built a successful business and a comfortable life in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing this terrible was supposed to happen. The investigation that ultimately led to Gacy's arrest began not with any of his murder victims but with the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest, who went missing on December 11, 1978, in Des Plaines, Illinois. Piest had told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a summer job before he vanished, and the contractor's name, which Piest had mentioned, was John Gacy. Des Plaines Police Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak led the initial investigation and quickly identified Gacy as a person of interest, discovering in the process that Gacy had a prior sodomy conviction in Iowa that he had never disclosed to the contractor's license board, a violation of Illinois law. Kozenzak obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home, and investigators made their first visit to Somerdale Avenue on December 13, 1978. They found nothing immediately incriminating during that first search, but they noticed the same smell Carol Hoff had noticed years earlier, and they found a receipt from a pharmacy connected to a young man named Kim Byers who was connected to the Nissen pharmacy where Piest had worked and where Gacy had been doing contracting work. They also found a class ring belonging to a missing person named John SYC, a ring Gacy claimed he had purchased from SYC himself, a claim investigators found implausible. They placed Gacy under physical surveillance, following him around the clock as he went about his daily life, watching him meet with clients, visit friends, drive through the neighborhoods he knew so well, and apparently function without any visible sign of panic despite knowing that investigators had been inside his house. Gacy's composure during this surveillance period was itself a testament to the depth of his psychological compartmentalization. He continued to conduct business, meet with his attorney, and socialize with friends while investigators watched him and while Robert Piest's body lay in a location Gacy had chosen after killing him. He invited the surveillance officers into a restaurant and bought them dinner, a display of brazen confidence that investigators found deeply unsettling and that later became a frequently cited illustration of how completely he had separated his public and private identities. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained a second search warrant and returned to Somerdale Avenue on December 21, 1978, this time with enough probable cause to conduct a more thorough search of the property. Within hours, one of the investigators probing the crawl space discovered what appeared to be human remains. The discovery triggered an immediate expansion of the search, and over the following days, as investigators worked through the cramped, foul-smelling space beneath 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, the full dimensions of what John Wayne Gacy had done beneath his home began to emerge in the most horrifying possible way. Body after body was recovered from the crawl space, some buried in lime to accelerate decomposition, some overlapping with others in the limited space available, some so decomposed that identification would take months of forensic work. The neighborhood that had gathered for Gacy's parties stood outside the police tape and watched the lights burning inside the house all night as officers carried out remains, and the community's understanding of the man they had known as their neighbor began to collapse in real time. Gacy was taken into custody on December 21, 1978, the same day the first remains were discovered. He initially attempted to maintain his composure and his cover story, but within days he began to confess, providing investigators with detailed accounts of his murders in a manner that alternated between clinical precision and apparent emotional detachment. He told investigators he had killed 30 people, then revised the number upward as questioning continued. He described individual victims, methods, and burial locations. He drew maps of the crawl space indicating where bodies had been placed. He told investigators about the 4 victims he had disposed of in the Des Plaines River. He described the rope trick. He described his methodology for selecting and approaching victims. And throughout these confessions, he periodically attempted to shift responsibility, invoking an alter ego he called Jack, claiming that Jack was the killer and that Gacy himself was not fully responsible for what Jack had done, an attempted dissociation defense that forensic psychiatrists who examined him comprehensively rejected. The recovery operation at Somerdale Avenue ultimately yielded 29 sets of human remains from the crawl space and surrounding property, with 4 additional victims recovered from the river, bringing the confirmed total to 33, making Gacy the most prolific serial killer in American history at the time of his arrest, a record that stood for years. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980, in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garippo. The prosecution was led by Assistant State's Attorney William Kunkel, who presented a methodical and devastating case built on physical evidence, testimony from survivors of Gacy's assaults who had not been killed, testimony from family members of victims, forensic evidence connecting Gacy to the remains recovered from his property, and Gacy's own confessions. The defense, led by attorneys Sam Amarant and Robert Mata, pursued an insanity defense, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and that the crimes had been committed by the alter ego Jack rather than by Gacy himself. They presented testimony from forensic psychiatrists who argued that Gacy was legally insane at the time of the murders. The prosecution countered with its own psychiatric experts, who testified that Gacy was a sadistic psychopath who had planned his crimes carefully, taken deliberate steps to avoid detection, maintained a functional and socially successful life throughout the period of the murders, and showed no genuine signs of the kind of dissociative disorder the defense was claiming. The jury, after only 2 hours of deliberation, returned guilty verdicts on all 33 counts of murder. The speed of the verdict, 2 hours for 33 murder counts, was itself a statement about how thoroughly the defense had failed to convince even a single juror that John Wayne Gacy was anything other than exactly what the prosecution had presented him as, a calculating, predatory killer who had made choices, not a man possessed by an alter ego he could not control. Judge Garippo sentenced Gacy to death on 12 of the murder counts, making him one of the most extensively condemned prisoners on Illinois' death row. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center, during which time he painted prolifically, producing hundreds of canvases featuring clown figures, skulls, and portraits of himself in his pogo costume, paintings that were sold through galleries and private dealers and that became themselves objects of morbid cultural fascination. He gave interviews to journalists, psychologists, and true crime writers, consistently maintaining in public that he was an innocent man who had been wrongfully convicted, a position that contradicted the detailed confessions he had given investigators immediately after his arrest and that most observers viewed as another expression of the narcissistic grandiosity that had defined his entire life. He filed appeal after appeal, each of which was rejected by the courts, as the legal system systematically exhausted every avenue through which he attempted to delay his execution. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old. His final meal was a bucket of Kentucky fried chicken, fried shrimp, French fries, and fresh strawberries. His last words, spoken to his attorney, were reported to be a declaration that the state was killing him, not that he deserved mercy, not that he was sorry, not a word for the 33 young men whose families had spent decades waiting for this moment. He was pronounced dead at 12:58 in the morning. The aftermath of the Gacy case left permanent marks on American law enforcement practice, forensic science, victim identification methodology, and the cultural understanding of how serial predators operate within communities. Of the 33 confirmed victims, only 25 were ever positively identified, leaving 8 sets of remains unidentified for decades. In 2011, the Cook County Sheriff's Office reopened the identification effort using advanced DNA technology, submitting samples from the unidentified remains to the FBI's combined DNA index system and working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Persons to cross-reference against missing persons cases from the 1970s. As of the time of Gacy's case files being most recently updated, several additional identifications had been made, though some victims remained officially unknown, their names lost to the circumstances of their lives, young men who had been runaways or hustlers or simply people without strong family connections who had disappeared into a city that was not looking for them. The case transformed the way law enforcement agencies approach missing persons reports involving young men, a category that had historically received significantly less investigative attention than missing women and children, a disparity that Gacy had exploited systematically. It contributed to the development of standardized protocols for processing potential crime scenes involving buried remains. It led to changes in contractor licensing requirements in Illinois requiring disclosure of prior criminal convictions. And it left Norwood Park Township, the quiet suburban neighborhood where the Summerdale Avenue house had stood, permanently altered, the house itself demolished in April 1979 as investigators completed their recovery operation, the lot left vacant for years before eventually being developed. The address changed to prevent it from becoming a destination for morbid tourism. The neighbors who had eaten Gacy's food, attended his parties, and waved to him across their fences spent the rest of their lives reconciling the man they had known with the truth of what he had been, a reconciliation that, for many of them, was never fully possible or complete. Number 3. Chris Watts, the devoted family man whose perfect suburban life was built on lies, and whose crimes shocked an entire nation. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina, the only child of Ronnie and Cindy Watts, a working-class family that by most accounts provided him with a stable, loving, and unremarkable upbringing in the American South. Those who knew Chris Watts as a child and teenager described him in terms that have become almost ritualistic in discussions of his case: quiet, agreeable, non-confrontational, eager to please, a young man who seemed to have no sharp edges, no obvious anger, no visible darkness, and no strong opinions of his own that he was willing to defend when challenged. He was not a standout student, not a standout athlete, not a standout anything in particular, simply a pleasant, mild-mannered boy who moved through his childhood and adolescence without generating strong impressions in any direction. He developed an early passion for cars and motorsports, a passion that gave him a sense of identity and competence that other areas of his life did not consistently provide, and he pursued this interest seriously enough to spend time in his late teens attempting to build a career as a NASCAR driver, a dream that ultimately did not materialize beyond local racing circuits but that represented perhaps the most authentically self-directed ambition of his young life. He graduated from high school, worked various jobs, and drifted through his early 20s without a clear sense of where he was going or who he was, a young man defined more by what he was not than by what he was, and completely unprepared, psychologically and emotionally, for the person who was about to enter his life and reshape it entirely. Sean Ann Honorati was born on January 10, 1984, in Aberdeen, North Carolina, and was by every measure the opposite of the man she would eventually marry. Where Chris was passive, Sean Ann was dynamic. Where Chris was vague and undefined, Sean Ann was vivid and certain. She had grown up navigating genuine hardship, including health challenges and financial difficulties, and had emerged from those experiences with a fierce determination to build the kind of abundant, beautiful, documented life that she had not always had access to. She was diagnosed with lupus as a young woman, a chronic autoimmune condition that required ongoing medical management and that she handled with a public openness and positivity that characterized her approach to every challenge she faced. She was a gifted saleswoman, eventually building a substantial career as an independent sales representative for Thrive, a health and wellness product company, and she documented her professional and personal life extensively on social media, particularly Facebook, where she cultivated a following of thousands of people who tuned in regularly to watch her family's life unfold in real time: the beautiful house, the adorable daughters, the date nights, the family vacations, the matching outfits, and always, at the center of the frame, the smiling family that seemed to have figured out how to make life look effortless and joyful. Chris and Sean Ann met around 2010 and married on November 3, 2012. In a ceremony that Sean Ann documented with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. They settled in Frederick, Colorado, a rapidly growing suburban community north of Denver, in a large, well-appointed house on Saratoga Trail that became the backdrop for the family's social media presence. Their daughter Bella Marie was born on December 17, 2013, and their second daughter Celeste Catherine, called Cece by the family, was born on July 17, 2015. By the summer of 2018, Sean Ann was pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico Lee Watts. From the outside, and from the carefully curated perspective of Sean Ann's social media feed, the Watts family appeared to be living exactly the life that suburban American aspiration promises: the house, the children, the successful careers, the devoted partnership, the beautiful future unfolding exactly as planned. The reality inside the house on Saratoga Trail was considerably more complicated and considerably darker than anything visible in the photographs and videos Sean Ann posted for her followers. The family's finances were in serious trouble, a fact that both Chris and Sean Ann were aware of but that they had not resolved and that had been generating significant stress in the marriage for an extended period. Despite Sean Ann's income from Thrive and Chris's salary from his job as an operator for the oil and gas company Anadarko Petroleum, the family was spending substantially more than they earned, carrying significant credit card debt, behind on their mortgage payments, and facing the prospect of foreclosure on the Saratoga Trail house. The financial pressure was real and mounting, and it sat beneath the surface of the family's public image like a fault line that had not yet produced a visible earthquake. Beyond the finances, the marriage itself had been struggling. Chris Watts was, by his own later admission and by the accounts of those who knew the couple, emotionally disengaged from his marriage in ways that had become increasingly pronounced over time. He described feeling trapped, suffocated by the responsibilities of family life, disconnected from Sean Ann in ways he had not confronted honestly or addressed directly, a man who had never been particularly skilled at identifying or expressing his own emotional interior and who responded to the growing dissatisfaction in his marriage not by addressing it but by suppressing it and looking elsewhere for the feelings his marriage was no longer providing. The elsewhere, in Chris Watts' case, was a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a colleague at Anadarko Petroleum whom he had begun a romantic relationship with in late June 2018, approximately 6 weeks before he murdered his family. Kessinger was 30 years old, professionally ambitious, physically attractive, and entirely unaware, she later told investigators and the public, of the depth of Chris Watts' deception regarding the state of his marriage and family life. Watts had told Kessinger that he was in the process of separating from Sean Ann, that the marriage was effectively over, and that the path was clear for the relationship with Kessinger to develop without complication. This was a lie of extraordinary magnitude, delivered to a woman who was making emotional investments based on the information she had been given, while Watts simultaneously maintained the appearance of a functioning marriage to a pregnant wife and 2 young daughters at home. The relationship with Kessinger intensified rapidly over those 6 weeks, and investigators who later analyzed Watts' phone records, text messages, and movements during this period concluded that the affair had become the emotional center of his existence in a way that his marriage and family had not been for some time. He was communicating with Kessinger constantly, meeting her when Sean-Ann and the girls were away, and constructing in his mind a version of his future that did not include the family he had built on Saratoga Trail. Sean-Ann Watts was away from home for much of the summer of 2018, traveling for her Thrive business and spending time in North Carolina with her family, a separation that had given Chris Watts the space and freedom to pursue the relationship with Kessinger without immediate risk of discovery. She returned to Frederick on the evening of Sunday, August 12, 2018, arriving home from the airport late after a business trip to Arizona, tired from the journey and from the demands of her pregnancy, which was then approximately 15 weeks along. She and Chris had a conversation that night that Sean-Ann later described in a text message to a friend as a difficult one, a conversation in which Chris had told her he was not sure he still wanted the marriage, a devastating admission from a husband whose wife was pregnant with their 3rd child and who had given every public indication of being a devoted family man. Sean-Ann went to bed in the early hours of Monday, August 13, 2018. She never woke up. At some point during those early morning hours, Chris Watts strangled his wife to death in the bed they shared while their daughters slept in their rooms down the hall. He then went to his daughters' rooms and killed both of them. Bella was 4 years old. Celeste was 3 years old. After killing his wife and daughters, Watts loaded their bodies into his work truck, drove to an Anadarko petroleum work site in Weld County called the Survey 319 site, and disposed of them. He buried Shanann's body in a shallow grave at the site. He placed Bella and Celeste's bodies inside oil storage tanks, forcing them through the narrow hatches at the top of the tanks in an act so brutal and so calculated that it has remained one of the most horrifying details in a case full of horrifying details, a detail that speaks not to a man who lost control in a moment of passion but to a man who made deliberate choices about how to dispose of the bodies of his own children. Chris Watts then drove home, went to work, and began the process of pretending his family had simply disappeared. When Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson arrived at the Saratoga Trail house later that Monday morning to check on Sean-Ann, who had missed a prenatal appointment and was not responding to texts, she found Chris at home and quickly became alarmed by his demeanor and by Shanann's continued unresponsiveness. Atkinson called the police, and Frederick police officers arrived at the house, where they encountered Chris Watts for the first time. His behavior during this initial interaction and in the hours and days that followed was observed by investigators, neighbors, media, and the millions of people who would later watch footage of those interactions, and it was universally described as profoundly wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate precisely but impossible to ignore. He was flat where grief would have been expected. He was mechanical where emotion would have been natural. He answered questions with a strange, scripted quality, as though he were performing a role he had not rehearsed quite enough. When a neighbor's doorbell camera had captured him loading items into his truck in the early morning hours of August 13th, the footage was immediately significant to investigators who were already finding his behavior inconsistent with genuine spousal concern. The investigation moved with remarkable speed. The FBI joined the case quickly, recognizing its complexity and the likelihood that the children had been transported across jurisdictional lines. Investigators executed search warrants on the Watts home and recovered significant evidence, including a fitted sheet from the master bedroom that showed signs consistent with the presence of a body, and biological material that forensic analysts were able to process rapidly. They examined Chris Watts' phone and discovered the communications with Nicole Kessinger, which immediately and dramatically changed the investigative picture by providing both a potential motive and a timeline of the affair that investigators could verify against other evidence. On August 15, 2018, 2 days after the murders, Chris Watts sat down for a nationally televised interview with Denver television station KMGH in which he made an emotional public appeal for the return of his family, addressing whoever had taken Sean-Ann and the girls directly and begging them to bring his family home. The interview was watched by millions of people and was almost universally identified by viewers, investigators, and behavioral analysts as the performance of a man who was lying, the flat effect, the unconvincing emotional displays, the scripted quality of the appeal combining to create an impression of profound inauthenticity that generated enormous public pressure on the investigation and on Watts himself. Later that same day, August 15th, investigators brought Watts into the Frederick Police Department for what they described as a conversation, using the FBI's PEACE model of investigative interviewing, a non-confrontational approach designed to encourage subjects to provide information by making them feel comfortable and unconfronted rather than pressured. During that conversation, Watts made a series of statements that investigators knew were false based on the evidence they had already collected, and then, in a moment that would become one of the most analyzed scenes in modern true crime history, Watts' father Ronnie was brought into the room and sat with his son while investigators played Ronnie the doorbell camera footage of Chris loading items into the truck in the early morning hours of August 13th. Facing his father with the footage on the table between them, Chris Watts began to crack. He admitted that he had killed Sean N. He claimed, in this initial confession, that he had strangled Sean N after discovering her strangling the girls, a claim that was biologically and forensically impossible and that investigators immediately recognized as a last attempt to construct a narrative in which his children's deaths could be attributed to someone other than himself. He was arrested on August 15, 2018, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Sean N., Bella, and Celeste, 1 count of first-degree murder for the death of unborn Nico, and additional charges relating to the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The bodies of Sean N., Bella, and Celeste were recovered from the Survey 319 site on August 16, 2018, following Watts' directions to investigators. The recovery of the children from inside the oil tanks required specialized equipment and personnel and produced scenes that the officers and investigators present described as among the most distressing of their professional careers. Autopsies confirmed that Sean N. had been strangled and that both girls had been smothered, medical findings consistent with the manner of death Watts later more fully described. The forensic evidence collected from the Watts home, the work truck, and the Survey 319 site was comprehensive and damning, and the Weld County District Attorney's Office, led by District Attorney Michael Rourke, built a case that legal observers described as overwhelming in its evidentiary weight. Facing the prospect of a trial that would have required Bella and Celeste's cause of death to be presented in graphic detail in a public courtroom, and potentially the imposition of the death penalty if convicted at trial, Watts entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors in November 2018. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including the 3 first-degree murder counts, the murder of unborn Nico, and charges related to the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts appeared before Weld County District Court Judge Marcelo Kopkow for sentencing. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the murders of Sean N., Bella, and Celeste, plus an additional consecutive term for the murder of unborn Nico, plus additional concurrent sentences on the remaining charges. He was transported to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, later moved to the Waupun Correctional Institution, both federal facilities chosen partly for security reasons related to the extraordinary public notoriety of the case and the legitimate concern that Watts' safety could not be guaranteed in a Colorado state facility where the full dimensions of his crimes were widely known among the inmate population. In February 2019, Watts agreed to a second, more comprehensive interview with investigators from the FBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the Frederick Police Department, an interview conducted at the Wisconsin Correctional Facility in which he provided a significantly fuller and more accurate account of what had happened on the night of August 12 and the early morning of August 13, 2018. In this interview, he recanted his earlier claim that Sean N. had killed the girls, admitting that he had killed Bella and Celeste himself, describing in detail how each child had died, and providing additional context about his state of mind, his relationship with Kessinger, and the events leading up to the murders that gave investigators and the public a more complete, if no less devastating, picture of what had happened inside the house on Saratoga Trail. The Watts case became one of the most widely followed true crime cases in American history, generating extensive media coverage, multiple documentary productions including a Netflix documentary released in 2020, and a level of public engagement that reflected something deeper than simple morbid fascination. Part of what made the case so profoundly disturbing to so many people was the degree to which the Watts family had seemed to represent something aspirational and recognizable, the young suburban family with the nice house and the healthy children and the social media presence that made their life look like evidence that the American dream was still accessible and still worth pursuing. The revelation that the husband and father at the center of that image had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 toddler daughters and disposed of their bodies in an oil field shattered something that many people who had followed Shanann's social media found genuinely difficult to process. Not just the horror of the individual crime but the broader implication that the surfaces people present to the world can be completely disconnected from the realities they conceal. Shanann Watts had documented her family's life with extraordinary thoroughness, creating a vast archive of images, videos, and written posts that captured the ordinary moments of family life with a warmth and specificity that made the loss of that family feel immediate and personal to people who had never met any of them. The contrast between the archive and the truth was not merely sad. It was shattering in a way that continued to resonate long after the legal proceedings concluded. The broader implications of the Watts case for discussions of intimate partner violence, the particular vulnerability of pregnant women to lethal violence from partners, and the systemic underrecognition of coercive control and emotional disengagement as precursors to lethal domestic violence have been extensively examined by researchers, advocates, and law enforcement professionals in the years since the murders. Studies consistently show that pregnancy is a period of heightened risk for women in relationships with abusive or unstable partners, and that the combination of financial stress, relational dissatisfaction, and the presence of a romantic rival that characterized the Watts marriage in the summer of 2018 represents a recognizable constellation of risk factors that advocates argue should trigger more proactive intervention by the social and medical systems that interact with pregnant women and their families. Nicole Kessinger, who cooperated fully with investigators and who maintained that she had been deceived by Watts about the true state of his marriage, eventually changed her name and relocated, attempting to rebuild a life that the association with the Watts case had made enormously difficult. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, and her brother Frankie, have remained publicly engaged with her memory, speaking at events related to domestic violence awareness and advocating for legislative changes in Colorado related to the protection of pregnant women and unborn children. Chris Watts remains in the Waupun Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, serving consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The house on Saratoga Trail long since sold to new owners who have no connection to what happened there, the oil field at Survey 319 still operating, the tanks where Bella and Celeste were found still standing in the high plains of Weld County under the enormous Colorado sky. Number 4, Scott Peterson, the charming fertilizer salesman who murdered his pregnant wife and unborn son while simultaneously planning a future with another woman. Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, in San Diego, California, the youngest of 5 children in a family that, by most outward measures, provided him with every advantage that comfortable American suburban life could offer. His mother, Jackie Peterson, was a devoted and intensely protective woman who by many accounts treated Scott as something close to the center of her universe, indulging him with a consistency and completeness that those who later examined his psychology would identify as a significant factor in the formation of a personality that struggled profoundly with the concept of consequences and the basic requirement that desires must sometimes be subordinated to obligations. His father, Lee Peterson, was a successful businessman, and the family lived well, moving between California and other locations as circumstances required, giving Scott a childhood characterized by material comfort, social ease, and the kind of confident entitlement that comes from growing up in an environment where things generally go your way and where the people around you are consistently invested in ensuring that they continue to do so. Scott was, by all accounts, genuinely charming in the way that some people are charming as a fundamental feature of their personality rather than as a calculated social strategy, the kind of young man who moved through rooms easily, made friends without apparent effort, and left most people who encountered him with a favorable impression that they would later struggle to reconcile with what they eventually learned about him. He attended Arizona State University on a golf scholarship, transferred to California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, and it was there, in the fall of 1994, that he met the woman who would become his wife, the woman he would murder 8 years later, and the woman whose disappearance on Christmas Eve 2002 would eventually become one of the most extensively covered criminal cases in American history. Lacey Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California, and was by the accounts of everyone who knew her a person of genuine warmth, energy, and infectious enthusiasm for life that made her the kind of friend, daughter, and partner that people felt lucky to have in their lives. She grew up in Modesto in a close family headed by her mother Sharon Rocha and stepfather Ron Gransky, and she carried that family closeness with her into adulthood as one of her most defining characteristics, a woman who understood and valued the connections that hold people together and who invested in those connections with consistency and genuine feeling. She and Scott met at a restaurant where she was working during her time at Cal Poly, and the attraction was immediate and mutual, the kind of early romantic connection that seems to confirm every optimistic thing people believe about love and partnership. They dated through college, and Scott proposed in August 1999 after several years together. They married on August 14, 2000, in a ceremony in Morro Bay, California, that friends and family described as joyful and full of the kind of genuine happiness that is unmistakable in retrospect precisely because of what came after. They settled in Modesto, where Scott worked as a salesman for Trade Corp, a fertilizer company, and where Lacey built a warm and beautiful home that reflected her genuine talent for creating spaces that felt welcoming and alive. By the fall of 2002, Lacey was pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already named Connor, due in February 2003, and the couple's social circle and both their families understood the pregnancy as the natural next chapter in what appeared to be a genuinely happy and stable marriage. The reality of Scott Peterson's interior life during this period was, as with so many cases of intimate partner homicide, almost entirely invisible to the people around him, concealed behind the social fluency and easy charm that had always been his most reliable tools for managing the impressions others formed of him. What investigators and the public eventually learned was that Scott Peterson had been conducting a romantic affair with a woman named Amber Frey since early November 2002, approximately 6 weeks before he murdered Lacey, and that the affair had developed with a speed and intensity that suggested Peterson was not treating it as a casual distraction but as a genuine alternative to the domestic life he had constructed in Modesto. Amber Frey was a massage therapist in Fresno, California, whom Peterson had met through a mutual friend, and she was, like Nicole Kessinger in the Watts case, a woman who was later able to demonstrate convincingly that she had been deceived about the fundamental nature of Peterson's life and marital status. Peterson had told Frey that he was not married, a lie of foundational magnitude that he had delivered with the same casual confidence he brought to every other aspect of his social performance. He had taken Frey to a work Christmas party in early December 2002, introducing her to colleagues and dancing with her in a display of romantic investment that Frey later described as genuine and that she had had no reason at the time to question or doubt. By Christmas Eve 2002, Peterson had been conducting this affair for approximately 6 weeks, had told Frey he was a widower who found the holiday season emotionally difficult because of the loss of his wife, a lie so precisely calibrated to generate sympathy and lower suspicion that it speaks to a manipulative intelligence operating at a level of deliberate calculation that is difficult to reconcile with any narrative of impulsive or unplanned violence. On the morning of December 24, 2002, Christmas Eve, Scott Peterson called his neighbor and friend Karen Servas at approximately 10:08 in the morning. He told her that he had come home to find the front door open and the family's golden retriever, Mackenzie, wandering the street outside with his leash still attached, and that Lacey was nowhere to be found. He said he was about to go to his parents' house and then drive to the Berkeley Marina, where he said he had been fishing that morning, to look for Lacey there. This account, which Peterson maintained consistently in his initial interactions with investigators, contained within it the seeds of the case that would eventually convict him, the Berkeley Marina alibi being one of the most scrutinized and ultimately damaging elements of the investigation. Lacey's family and friends were contacted, a search was organized, and Modesto Police Department detectives arrived at the Peterson home on Covina Avenue to begin what they initially approached as a missing persons investigation. The disappearance of a visibly pregnant woman on Christmas Eve generated immediate and intense community concern, and the search for Lacey Peterson became a major local and then national story within days, with hundreds of volunteers joining organized search efforts coordinated by Lacey's family and community organizations, while Scott Peterson stood in front of cameras and made public appeals for information about his missing wife with a composure that many observers found troubling from the earliest days of the investigation. The Modesto Police Department assigned Detective Al Brocchini to the case on the evening of December 24th, and Brocchini's initial interview with Scott Peterson that night produced the first of many inconsistencies that would accumulate over the following weeks and months into a portrait of a man whose account of his own activities did not withstand scrutiny. Peterson told Brocchini he had been golfing the morning of December 24th, then corrected himself and said he had been fishing at the Berkeley Marina, a revision that Brocchini noted carefully. The Berkeley Marina was approximately 90 miles from the Peterson home in Modesto, a significant distance for a spontaneous solo fishing trip on Christmas Eve morning by a man whose pregnant wife was home expecting to attend a family party that afternoon. Peterson said he had gone to the marina to use a boat he had recently purchased, a 14-foot aluminum fishing boat that he had bought just weeks earlier and that he had apparently told no one in his immediate social circle about, including Lacey, according to the accounts of those who later spoke with investigators. The boat itself became a focal point of the investigation as detectives examined it for forensic evidence and as the question of what Peterson had actually been doing at the Berkeley Marina that morning became increasingly central to the case. Investigators noted that the marina was located in San Francisco Bay, and they began the process of building a hypothesis, one that the eventual discovery of remains would confirm, about what Peterson had done with his wife's body. The investigation into Lacey Peterson's disappearance intensified dramatically when investigators learned about Amber Frey. On December 30, 2002, 6 days after Lacey vanished, Frey contacted the Modesto Police Department after seeing news coverage of the case and recognizing Scott Peterson as the man she had been in a romantic relationship with, the man who had told her he was a widower, the man who had taken her to a Christmas party and danced with her while his pregnant wife was, Frey now understood, very much alive and very much his wife. Frey's decision to contact police and her subsequent cooperation with the investigation were pivotal to the case's outcome. At the direction of investigators, Frey continued to communicate with Peterson by phone while investigators recorded the calls, creating an extraordinary archive of conversations in which Peterson, knowing his wife was missing and knowing he was a person of interest in her disappearance, continued to conduct an active romantic relationship with another woman, making plans, expressing affection, and managing Frey's growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong with the situation she had been drawn into. These recorded phone calls, eventually running to hundreds of hours of conversation, became both critical evidence at trial and a window into the psychology of a man capable of extraordinary compartmentalization and extraordinary deception, a man who could discuss romantic futures with Amber Frey while Lacey Peterson's body lay in the waters of San Francisco Bay. On April 13, 2003, a partial set of human remains was discovered on the eastern shoreline of San Francisco Bay in Contra Costa County, near the city of Richmond. The following day, a second set of remains was discovered nearby. The first set was identified as the body of a male fetus, the second as the torso of a woman. DNA testing confirmed that the fetal remains were those of Connor Peterson and that the torso was Lacey Peterson. Both had washed ashore in an area of San Francisco Bay that was directly consistent with the trajectory that investigators and oceanographic experts had modeled for objects disposed of in the waters near the Berkeley Marina on or around December 24, 2002. The recovery of the remains transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation and provided the physical anchor for the prosecution's theory that Scott Peterson had transported his wife's body to the marina on Christmas Eve morning and deposited it in the bay from the newly purchased fishing boat. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, in La Jolla, California, near the Mexican border. At the time of his arrest, he had dyed his hair and beard blonde, was carrying approximately $15,000 in cash, had multiple cell phones, and was in possession of his brother's identification documents, circumstances that prosecutors later cited as evidence of consciousness of guilt and preparation for flight, and that the public immediately interpreted as the behavior of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was attempting to escape its consequences. The trial of Scott Peterson was one of the most extensively covered criminal proceedings in American history, a media spectacle of a scale and intensity that generated significant debate about the appropriate relationship between press coverage and the integrity of criminal proceedings. Venue was changed from Stanislaus County to San Mateo County due to the impossibility of seating an impartial jury in Modesto after the saturation coverage of the preceding months. The trial began in June 2004 before Judge Alfred DeLucci, with prosecutor Rick DiStaso leading the state's case and defense attorney Mark Garagos, one of the most prominent criminal defense lawyers in the country, representing Peterson. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, as no witness had seen Peterson commit the murders, no confession had been obtained, and the condition of the recovered remains had made it impossible to determine cause of death with forensic certainty. DiStaso argued that the combination of available evidence, the affair with Amber Fry, Peterson's purchase of the boat weeks before Lacey's disappearance, the Berkeley Marina alibi that placed him at the location where the bodies eventually surfaced, the forensic evidence examined at the couple's home and in the boat, the hair consistent with Lacey's found in the boat, Peterson's behavior during the investigation, the phone calls with Fry, the circumstances of his arrest, and the oceanographic analysis connecting the disposal location to the recovery location constituted a comprehensive and convincing circumstantial case for guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, led by Garagos, attempted to present an alternative theory in which Lacey had been abducted by a third party, arguing that witnesses in the neighborhood had reported seeing a pregnant woman matching Lacey's description walking her dog after the time Peterson claimed to have left for the marina, a timeline that Garagos argued exculpated his client. Garagos pointed to other persons of interest who had been investigated and cleared, attempted to challenge the reliability of the oceanographic analysis, and argued that the prosecution's circumstantial case, however extensive, did not meet the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury, after deliberating for 7 days, returned a verdict of guilty on November 12, 2004, finding Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of unborn Connor Peterson. The distinction between the 2 degrees of murder reflected the jury's finding that the killing of Connor, while intentional, had occurred as a consequence of the killing of Lacey rather than as a separately premeditated act. The penalty phase of the trial resulted in the jury recommending the death penalty for the first-degree murder conviction, and Judge DeLucci sentenced Peterson to death in March 2005, sending him to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he would remain for more than 15 years. The legal proceedings did not end with the death sentence. Peterson's case moved through the California appellate system over the following years, generating multiple rounds of briefing and argument on issues ranging from juror misconduct to the adequacy of the trial court's handling of pretrial publicity. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court vacated Peterson's death sentence, not on the basis of any finding related to his guilt, which the court affirmed, but on the ground that the trial court had improperly dismissed prospective jurors who had expressed opposition to the death penalty, a ruling that required a new penalty phase hearing to determine whether Peterson would be sentenced to death or life without parole. In October 2021, at a resentencing hearing in San Mateo County, Judge Ann-Christine Macello sentenced Scott Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole, replacing the vacated death sentence and resolving the penalty phase of the case. Peterson was transferred from death row to the general population at a California state correctional facility following the resentencing, where he remains as of the most recent available information, serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole for the murders of Lacey and Connor Peterson. The Peterson case left an enduring mark on California law, American media culture, and the broader public understanding of intimate partner homicide. California passed legislation commonly known as the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, which codifies legal protections for unborn children as a direct response to the questions raised by the case about how the law should treat the killing of a viable fetus in the context of a criminal homicide. The case also contributed to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons cases involving pregnant women, with researchers and advocates pointing to the Peterson case as a crystallizing example of the elevated homicide risk faced by pregnant women in relationships characterized by the kind of hidden dissatisfaction, secret infidelity, and coercive emotional control that investigators eventually documented in the Peterson marriage. The Amber Fry phone calls, eventually published in book form and broadcast in excerpted form during the trial, became a cultural touchstone for discussions about deception in intimate relationships and the extraordinary capacity of some individuals to maintain parallel emotional lives without apparent distress or cognitive dissonance. Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, wrote a memoir about her daughter and the case, dedicating herself in the years following the trial to advocacy work on behalf of victims of domestic violence and their families, carrying Lacey and Connor's memory forward in the way that only the people who loved them most could. Scott Peterson has continued to maintain his innocence from prison, his case taken up by advocates who argue that the circumstantial nature of the evidence against him warrants further review, a position that the California courts have thus far declined to adopt in any way that has materially changed his legal situation. Lacey Peterson was 27 years old when she died. Connor Peterson never drew a breath outside his mother's body. They are buried together in a cemetery in Escalon, California, their names on a shared stone, the end of a story that should have been only the beginning. Number 5. Jerry Brudos, the electrical engineer who hid a murderous secret life behind the walls of his garage while his wife and children lived in the house next door. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, the second of two sons in a family that relocated frequently during his childhood and that was defined, in ways that would prove psychologically decisive, by the presence of a cold, withholding, and consistently disapproving mother who had wanted a daughter when Jerry was born and who made no particular effort to conceal that disappointment from the son she had gotten instead. Eileen Brudos was by multiple accounts a harsh and emotionally unavailable woman who favored Jerry's older brother Larry openly and consistently, criticizing Jerry with a frequency and a sharpness that those who later examined his development identified as a foundational element in the construction of a psychology that combined profound social insecurity with a specific and escalating hatred directed at women who reminded him, consciously or not, of the first woman who had rejected and diminished him. The family eventually settled in California, and it was there, at the age of 5, that Jerry Brudos had the experience that investigators and forensic psychologists would later identify as the origin point of the fetish that would eventually consume and then define his entire psychological life. Playing near a junkyard, the 5-year-old Jerry discovered a pair of women's high-heeled shoes and was immediately and powerfully drawn to them in a way he could not explain and would spend the rest of his life attempting to satisfy. He took the shoes home. His mother discovered them and reacted with a fury that combined genuine alarm at what she had found with the contempt for her son that colored so many of their interactions, forcing him to burn the shoes as punishment and leaving him with an experience in which the object of his nascent desire had been simultaneously discovered, punished, and destroyed, a psychological combination that researchers who study fetishistic development have identified as potentially intensifying rather than extinguishing the underlying fixation. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Brudos stole women's shoes and underwear from neighbors' homes and from clotheslines, building a secret collection that he hid from his family and that represented the first consistent expression of a compulsive inner life that was developing entirely outside the awareness of anyone around him. At the age of 17, he abducted a young woman at knife point and forced her to pose for photographs, his first act of violence against a real person rather than an imagined one, an escalation that resulted in his arrest and a period of psychiatric evaluation at the Oregon State Hospital, where clinicians assessed him and identified disturbing elements in his psychology but ultimately released him without a diagnosis that would have triggered any long-term intervention or monitoring. This institutional failure, the assessment of a 17-year-old who had already committed a violent abduction and concluded that no sustained treatment was required, would prove to be one of the most consequential missed opportunities in the history of the case, a moment at which the trajectory that ended in 4 murders and the devastation of 4 families might theoretically have been altered. Instead, Bruttos returned to ordinary life, completed his education, developed a genuine aptitude for electronics and electrical engineering, served in the United States Army, and eventually established himself as a skilled and employable technician whose professional competence gave him the economic foundation and the social credibility to build the domestic life that would serve, for years, as the most effective camouflage for what he actually was. Bruttos married Ralphine, a woman several years younger than him, in 1961, and the couple settled eventually in Salem, Oregon, where Bruttos worked as an electrician and where they built a life together that included 2 children, a modest house in a residential neighborhood, and a garage attached to the property that Bruttos claimed as his personal workspace and that he kept locked and off-limits to his wife and children at all times, a boundary he enforced with a rigidity that Ralphine later told investigators she had accepted without fully questioning, understanding it as an expression of her husband's need for a private space for his technical work and his hobbies. What Bruttos was doing in the garage, and what the garage contained, was something that Ralphine either did not know or did not allow herself to know, a distinction that investigators and prosecutors grappled with during the case and that was never definitively resolved. The garage was where Bruttos kept his collection of women's shoes and clothing, a collection that had grown over the years to encompass hundreds of items acquired through theft and other means. It was where he dressed in women's clothing and photographed himself. It was where he constructed and maintained the fantasy life that had been running parallel to his domestic existence since childhood. And it was where, beginning in 1968, he brought the women he abducted and murdered, using the locked, private space that his family had given him without question as the literal location of his crimes, the place where 4 women died while Ralphine and the children went about their lives in the house 30 feet away. The murders began in January 1968, when Bruttos was 28 years old and had been married for 7 years. Linda Slauson was a 19-year-old encyclopedia saleswoman who knocked on the door of the Bruttos home in Portland, Oregon, on January 26, 1968, as part of her sales route. Bruttos answered the door, invited her inside on the pretense of considering a purchase, and at some point during her visit lured her to the basement of the house, where he killed her. He then transported her body to his garage, where he engaged with it in ways consistent with the specific nature of his fetishistic obsessions before disposing of her remains in the Willamette River, weighting the body to prevent it from surfacing. Linda Slauson's disappearance was reported, investigated briefly, and then effectively filed away, as missing persons cases involving young women with independent lives and mobile employment often were in that era, particularly when there was no immediate evidence of foul play and no obvious connection to any known criminal. Bruttos returned to his life. He went to work. He came home. He locked himself in the garage. And 9 months later, in November 1968, he killed again. Jan Whitney was a 23-year-old student at the University of Oregon who disappeared on November 26, 1968, after her car broke down on Interstate 5 near Albany, Oregon. Bruttos, who was driving on the same road, stopped and offered her assistance, using the social script of the helpful motorist to gain her trust before abducting her. He brought Whitney back to his garage in Salem, where he kept her alive for a period before killing her, and where he engaged in the same post-mortem behaviors that had characterized his treatment of Linda Slauson, behaviors driven by the specific sexual fetishes that had been developing and intensifying since his childhood discovery of those shoes in the junkyard. He disposed of Whitney's body in the Long Tom River. Again, her disappearance was investigated, and again, no connection to Bruttos was made. He was an employed, married man with children in a quiet residential neighborhood, and nothing in his visible life pointed investigators in his direction. The investigation into Whitney's disappearance remained open but inactive, one of hundreds of unsolved missing persons cases in Oregon in that era, generating no pressure on the man responsible and providing him no reason to alter his behavior or his sense of invulnerability. In March 1969, Bruttos abducted and murdered Karen Sprinker, a 19-year-old student at Oregon State University who disappeared from a parking garage in Salem on March 27, 1969, after Brudos forced her into his car at gunpoint while she was returning to her vehicle after shopping. Sprinker was the third victim, and her murder was followed just 2 months later by the abduction and murder of Linda Sally, a 22-year-old woman who disappeared from a shopping center in Portland on April 23, 1969. With the disappearances of Karen Sprinker and Linda Sally occurring in relatively close succession and in locations that allowed investigators to begin identifying geographic and circumstantial patterns, the Oregon State Police and local law enforcement agencies began to recognize that they were dealing with a series of crimes rather than isolated incidents. The investigation intensified significantly when the bodies of Karen Sprinker and Linda Sally were recovered from the Long Tom River in May 1969, the discovery of physical remains transforming the investigation from missing persons to homicide and providing forensic evidence that investigators could analyze for connections to a perpetrator. The physical evidence recovered with the bodies was both critical and deeply revealing of the specific psychology driving the crimes. Both bodies had been bound with electrical wire consistent with the type used in professional electrical work, a detail that provided investigators with a potential occupational profile of the perpetrator. One of the bodies was found wearing a brassiere that was several sizes too large for the victim, a detail that immediately suggested to investigators that the garment had been placed on the body by the perpetrator rather than worn by the victim, pointing toward fetishistic behavior and providing a highly specific behavioral signature that narrowed the profile of the offender considerably. Investigators also recovered a distinctive foot severed from one of the victims, a detail that spoke directly to the specific nature of Brudos' fetishistic obsessions and that provided one of the most disturbing and specifically identifying pieces of behavioral evidence in the case. Oregon State Police Detective Jim Stovall, who led the investigation, began developing a profile of the likely perpetrator based on the accumulated evidence, including the electrical wire, the behavioral signatures at the crime scenes, and the geographic concentration of the crimes in the Willamette Valley. Stovall's investigation led him to canvass women at Oregon State University who had reported being approached by suspicious men, and this canvassing produced descriptions and accounts that eventually pointed investigators toward Jerry Brudos. The arrest came in May 1969, after investigators identified Brudos as a person of interest through the university canvassing and conducted surveillance of him that confirmed his continued predatory behavior toward women on the Oregon State campus. When investigators executed a search warrant on the Brudos home and garage in late May 1969, what they found inside the locked garage was a comprehensive physical record of years of fetishistic behavior and the specific evidence of the murders, including photographs Brudos had taken of his victims, items of women's clothing and shoes consistent with those recovered with the bodies, and physical evidence connecting Brudos to the crimes in multiple specific ways. The search of the garage was described by the investigators who conducted it as one of the most disturbing crime scene examinations of their careers, the physical inventory of a secret life that had been operating in plain sight for years, contained within a locked structure that Brudos' own family had treated as simply his private workspace, never knowing what it actually held. Brudos was arrested on May 30, 1969, and taken into custody without significant resistance. He was 30 years old, a husband and father of 2, a working electrician, and the man responsible for 4 murders whose bodies bore the unmistakable physical signatures of a psychology that had been building toward this outcome since a 5-year-old boy found a pair of women's shoes near a junkyard in California. The legal proceedings against Jerry Brudos moved with relative efficiency by the standards of the era. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the prosecution focusing on the 3 cases for which the physical and forensic evidence was strongest, the murders of Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally, with the murder of Linda Slauson serving as contextual background to the pattern of behavior the prosecution presented to the court. Brudos initially attempted to minimize his culpability through his interactions with investigators and in early legal proceedings, but the weight of the physical evidence recovered from the garage made any sustained denial effectively impossible to maintain. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder in June 1969, a resolution that spared victims' families the ordeal of a full trial while also depriving the public of the detailed presentation of evidence that a trial would have produced. Judge Val Sloper sentenced Brudos to 3 concurrent life terms at the Oregon State Penitentiary, a sentence that reflected the sentencing framework available to the court at the time, Oregon not having a death penalty in effect in 1969 in a form applicable to Brutto's crimes. Brutto spent the remainder of his life at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he became one of the most studied subjects in the emerging field of serial killer psychology. FBI Special Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas, the pioneering figures of the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit, interviewed Brutto as part of their landmark research into the psychology and behavior of convicted serial killers, research that eventually formed the foundation of criminal profiling as a systematic investigative discipline and that was later described in Douglas' memoir Mindhunter, which became the basis for a widely viewed Netflix dramatization. Brutto was a cooperative and articulate interview subject who provided detailed accounts of his crimes, his fantasies, and the developmental history of his fetishistic psychology, information that contributed significantly to the behavioral science community's understanding of the relationship between childhood trauma, fetishistic development, and escalating sexual violence. He was, in the context of research interviews, almost professorial in his willingness to analyze his own psychology, a quality that researchers found both valuable and deeply unsettling. The detachment of a man who could discuss the murders of 4 women with the same clinical remove he might bring to a technical problem in his electrical work. Ralphine Brutto divorced her husband shortly after his conviction, taking their children and attempting to rebuild a life that the revelation of what had been happening in their locked garage had fundamentally destroyed. She maintained for years that she had not known what Brutto was doing, a claim that was accepted by investigators who concluded that while her willingness to defer completely to her husband's demand for an inviolate private space had created the conditions that enabled his crimes, there was insufficient evidence to establish that she had actual knowledge of what those crimes were. The children of Jerry and Ralphine Brutto grew up under assumed names, their identities protected as far as possible from the association with their father's crimes, and little is publicly known about their lives in the decades since the case. The families of Linda Slauson, Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sally lived with the particular grief of having lost daughters and sisters to a man who had treated them not as human beings but as objects in a fantasy, whose final disposal of their bodies in rivers reflected the same dehumanizing logic that had driven every aspect of his crimes. Jerry Brutto died of liver cancer at the Oregon State Penitentiary on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67, having served 37 years of his life sentence, never released, never paroled, dying in the institution where he had spent the majority of his adult life. The locked garage on the quiet residential street in Salem, Oregon, was long since demolished, the house long since occupied by people with no connection to what happened there, the neighborhood absorbed into the ordinary ongoing life of a city that has grown and changed enormously in the more than 5 decades since Jerry Brutto was led away from it in handcuffs. The broader significance of the Brutto case in the history of forensic psychology and criminal investigation cannot be overstated. His case was among the first to be systematically analyzed through the lens of what would become known as criminal profiling, the methodology of inferring characteristics of an unknown perpetrator from the behavioral evidence left at crime scenes, and the specific behavioral signatures he left, the electrical wire, the fetishistic treatment of victims' bodies, the geographic concentration of crimes in areas familiar to the perpetrator, contributed directly to the development of analytical frameworks that have since been applied in hundreds of investigations. The case also contributed to the gradual transformation of how law enforcement agencies approach missing persons cases involving young women, and to the recognition that the absence of an obvious suspect or an obvious crime scene does not mean that no crime has occurred. Perhaps most enduringly, the Brutto case became a foundational example in the psychological literature of the concept of the organized, socially functional serial killer, the offender who maintains employment, family relationships, and community standing while conducting a hidden criminal life that is in every psychological sense his true existence, the life in the locked garage that is more real to him than the life in the house next door. Jerry Brutto was a husband, a father, a skilled electrician, a neighbor, and a man who went to work every day and came home every night. He was also a man who had been building toward murder since he was 5 years old, and who found in the locked garage the space to become, finally and completely, what he had always been becoming. Number 6. Russell Williams, the decorated Canadian Air Force colonel whose distinguished military career concealed a secret life of predatory violence that shocked an entire nation. David Russell Williams was born on March 7, 1963, in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire, England, the son of Christine Williams and Cedric David Williams, a metallurgist whose professional work eventually brought the family across the Atlantic to Canada when Russell was still a young child. The family settled in Chalk River, Ontario, a small community in the Ottawa Valley whose identity was defined largely by the presence of the Chalk River Laboratories, a major nuclear research facility operated by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited where Cedric Williams worked as a scientist. Russell grew up in this environment of technical precision and institutional order, attending local schools and developing the academic and personal qualities that would characterize his public presentation throughout his life: a careful, disciplined, methodical intelligence combined with an instinct for social performance that allowed him to project exactly the image most useful to his circumstances at any given time. His parents divorced when he was a child, and his mother eventually remarried Maynard Williams, whose surname Russell adopted, creating the name by which he would be known throughout his adult and professional life. Those who knew Williams as a young man in Chalk River and later as a student at the University of Toronto, where he studied economics and political science in the early 1980s, described him in terms that would become familiar in the years following his arrest: composed, intelligent, reliable, the kind of person who inspired confidence through sheer consistency of presentation without ever revealing very much of what was actually happening inside him. Williams joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1987, enlisting as an officer candidate and beginning a military career that would prove to be genuinely distinguished by any objective measure of professional achievement. He trained as a military pilot and demonstrated exceptional aptitude, eventually qualifying to fly a remarkable range of aircraft including the CF-18 Hornet fighter jet, the Hercules transport aircraft, the Airbus A310 that served as Canada's VIP transport, and the Boeing CC-144 Challenger, the aircraft used to transport members of the Canadian government and the royal family on official visits to Canada. He flew Queen Elizabeth II. He flew Prince Philip. He flew the Governor-General of Canada and the Prime Minister. He accumulated thousands of flight hours, earned consistent commendations from superior officers, rose steadily through the ranks, and in 2004 was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. In 2009, he was promoted again to the rank of Colonel and appointed Commanding Officer of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the largest and busiest military airbase in Canada, located near the city of Belleville in southeastern Ontario. CFB Trenton was a facility of enormous strategic and symbolic importance to the Canadian military, serving as the primary hub for military airlift operations including the repatriation of Canadian soldiers killed in Afghanistan, a responsibility that gave the base's commanding officer a particular visibility and a particular gravity in the national consciousness during the years of Canada's combat involvement in that conflict. Russell Williams was that commanding officer. He was 46 years old, at the absolute pinnacle of a military career that had taken him from a childhood in a small Ontario town to the command of Canada's most important airbase, a career built on the apparent virtues of discipline, competence, and institutional loyalty that the military prizes above almost everything else. He was also, at the time of his appointment to command CFB Trenton, already years deep into a pattern of criminal behavior that would eventually be revealed as one of the most disturbing cases of predatory violence in Canadian history. The criminal behavior that Williams had been conducting in parallel with his military career had begun, as best as investigators were later able to determine, in September 2007, 2 years before his appointment to command Trenton and more than a year before the crimes that would eventually lead to his arrest. The earliest phase of his criminal activity consisted of what investigators characterized as residential break-ins targeting the homes of young women and girls in the communities surrounding his various postings, burglaries in which Williams entered homes when their occupants were absent, photographed himself wearing the underwear and other intimate clothing he found there, and then took those items with him when he left. The targets of these early break-ins were chosen with a predatory deliberateness that became clearer as the full scope of his activities was eventually catalogued, Williams selecting homes based on surveillance he conducted of neighborhoods, identifying properties occupied by women and girls whose clothing and personal spaces appealed to the specific nature of his obsessions. Between September 2007 and the commission of his first sexual assault in 2009, investigators eventually documented more than 80 residential break-ins attributable to Williams, a staggering number that reflected both the compulsive escalation of his behavior and the extraordinary audacity of a man who was conducting these crimes while simultaneously performing at the highest levels of one of Canada's most demanding and prestigious professional institutions. The meticulous documentation Williams created of his own crimes was one of the most psychologically striking aspects of the case and one of the most forensically significant. Williams photographed himself during virtually every break-in, creating thousands of images that cataloged his activities in the homes he targeted with a specificity and organization that reflected the same methodical precision he brought to his professional responsibilities. He stored these images on his personal computers, organizing them in folders sorted by victim and by date, maintaining what amounted to a comprehensive archive of his criminal activities that served some psychological function investigators and forensic psychologists could identify as related to the fetishistic and exhibitionistic dimensions of his behavior, but that was also, objectively, the kind of evidence that could only have been created by someone who either did not believe he would ever be caught or who was, on some level, indifferent to that possibility. The archive eventually recovered from Williams' computers ran to thousands of images, a documented record of years of predatory behavior that investigators described as unlike anything they had encountered in previous cases, both in its volume and in the clinical, organized manner in which it had been created and maintained. The escalation from burglary to sexual violence occurred in September 2009, several months after Williams had assumed command of CFB Trenton, when he broke into the home of a young woman in Tweed, Ontario, a small community where Williams and his wife Mary Elizabeth Harriman owned a cottage that they used as a weekend retreat. The victim, a neighbor who lived near the Williams cottage, was at home when Williams entered, and he tied her up, sexually assaulted her over a prolonged period, and photographed the assault before leaving her bound in her home. He returned weeks later and assaulted the same woman again, a repetition that reflected both the specific predatory targeting that characterized his behavior and the escalating boldness of a man who had committed these crimes without consequence for long enough to believe, with what turned out to be diminishing justification, that his position and his carefully maintained public image made him effectively untouchable. A second sexual assault victim in the Tweed area was targeted in November 2009, an attack that followed the same pattern of home invasion, restraint, and prolonged assault documented in photographs Williams took during the crime. Both victims survived these assaults, traumatized and physically harmed but alive, and both reported the crimes to investigators, generating an investigation that was active but that had not yet identified Williams as a suspect when his crimes escalated to murder. The murder of Corporal Marie-France Comeau was the moment at which Russell Williams crossed the line from which no professional reputation, no military rank, and no carefully constructed public persona could ultimately protect him. Corporal Comeau was a 27-year-old flight attendant serving with the Canadian Forces at CFB Trenton, meaning she served under Williams' direct command, a fact that added a dimension of institutional betrayal to the crime that was particularly devastating to the military community that processed the case in the months following. On November 25, 2009, Williams broke into Comeau's home in Brighton, Ontario, waited for her to return, and when she did, bound and sexually assaulted her before killing her. He took extensive photographs throughout. He then staged the scene to suggest a burglary and left, returning to his command responsibilities at CFB Trenton with a composure that his subordinates and colleagues noticed nothing unusual in, because Williams' composure was, and had always been, effectively indistinguishable from his ordinary professional demeanor. Comeau's body was discovered the following day. The investigation that followed was handled by the Ontario Provincial Police and generated significant intensity given that the victim was a serving member of the Canadian Forces, but it did not immediately produce a suspect, and Williams continued to command CFB Trenton while detectives worked the case. The second murder occurred on January 28, 2010, when Williams broke into the home of Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman who lived near his Tweed cottage. He abducted Lloyd from her home, keeping her alive for approximately 40 hours, during which he subjected her to prolonged sexual violence and photographed every phase of what he did to her, before killing her and disposing of her body in a rural location near Tweed. Lloyd's disappearance was reported when she failed to appear for a family obligation, and the investigation into her whereabouts was initiated quickly. Ontario Provincial Police Detective Sergeant Jim Smith, who would later conduct the interrogation that broke Williams, was among the investigators who worked the Lloyd disappearance from its earliest stages. The investigation produced a critical piece of physical evidence almost immediately in the form of tire tracks and boot prints found near Lloyd's property that matched an SUV and boots consistent with military issue, evidence that was specific enough to provide investigators with a meaningful lead, but that on its own did not point to any individual suspect until it was combined with additional information developed over the following days. The combination of the Lloyd disappearance with the ongoing investigations into the Como murder and the 2 sexual assaults in Tweed created a geographic and behavioral pattern that investigators were beginning to recognize as connected, and the proximity of Williams' Tweed cottage to multiple crime scenes was identified as significant. On February 6, 2010, as part of a broader investigative effort that included roadblocks and canvassing in the Tweed area seeking information about vehicles seen near Jessica Lloyd's property around the time of her disappearance, Ontario Provincial Police officers stopped and briefly interviewed Russell Williams, who was driving in the area and who interacted with the officers at the roadblock with his characteristic composure, providing his information and proceeding on his way without generating any immediate alarm. The tire tracks on his vehicle were photographed by officers at the roadblock as part of the standard documentation procedure, and when those photographs were compared to the tracks recovered from Jessica Lloyd's property, the match was clear enough that investigators identified Williams as a person of serious interest within days of the roadblock encounter. On February 7, 2010, Detective Sergeant Jim Smith contacted Williams and asked him to come to the Ontario Provincial Police Detachment in Ottawa for an interview, framing the request in terms that did not immediately signal the level of suspicion investigators had developed. Williams arrived at the interview accompanied only by the confidence of a man who had spent decades managing impressions and who believed, perhaps, that his rank and reputation would provide a buffer that the evidence being assembled against him would not be able to penetrate. Smith conducted the interview using a methodical, evidence-based approach that began with open-ended questions and gradually introduced specific pieces of physical evidence, each one tightening the circle around Williams in a way that became visible on the recordings of the interrogation that were later analyzed extensively and that are now widely studied in law enforcement training contexts as an example of effective interrogation technique in high-stakes circumstances. Smith showed Williams the tire track comparisons. He showed him boot print comparisons. He explained the DNA evidence that had been developed from the crime scenes. He was calm, precise, and relentless, and over approximately 3 hours, the composure that had protected Russell Williams for his entire adult life began, visibly and unmistakably, to crack. Williams eventually told Smith that he understood the situation he was in. He asked about the implications for his wife. And then, with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized every aspect of his professional life, he began to confess, providing investigators with a comprehensive account of his crimes that covered the murders, the sexual assaults, and the more than 80 break-ins that had preceded them, an account delivered with a precision and detail that reflected both genuine memory and the existence of the photographic archive he had maintained throughout. While Williams was being interviewed by Smith in Ottawa, other investigators were executing search warrants on his homes in Ottawa and Tweed, and it was during these searches that the full scope of his secret life became physically manifest for the first time. The computers recovered from his properties contained the thousands of photographs he had taken, documenting years of criminal activity in an archive that investigators described as staggering in both its volume and its organizational precision. The storage bins in his Ottawa home contained an enormous collection of women's and girls' underwear and other intimate clothing, items taken from the homes he had burglarized over the preceding years, each item retained as a trophy and organized with the same methodical care he had brought to every other aspect of his behavior. The physical evidence was comprehensive and conclusive, and Williams' own confession, voluntarily and fully provided in the hours of interrogation conducted by Smith, left no legal ambiguity about what he had done and no realistic possibility of a defense that could have produced any outcome other than conviction. Williams directed investigators to the location where he had disposed of Jessica Lloyd's body, and her remains were recovered on February 8, 2010, from a wooded area near Tweed, bringing a terrible resolution to the search that her family had been living through since her disappearance. Russell Williams was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd, 2 counts of forcible confinement and sexual assault for the attacks on the 2 Tweed women who had survived, and 82 counts of breaking and entering. He appeared before Ontario Superior Court Justice Robert Scott in Belleville, Ontario, on October 18, 2010, and entered guilty pleas to all charges, a comprehensive admission of guilt that the prosecution and the court accepted as the basis for proceeding directly to sentencing. The sentencing hearing was one of the most intensely attended criminal proceedings in recent Canadian history, with the courtroom and the overflow areas outside filled with members of the public, the media, and the military community that had been devastated by the revelation of what their commanding officer had been. Victim impact statements were delivered by the families of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd, by the survivors of the sexual assaults, and by members of the broader community affected by Williams' crimes, statements that documented in human terms the full dimensions of the destruction he had caused. Justice Scott sentenced Williams to 2 concurrent terms of life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years on the murder counts, plus additional concurrent sentences on the sexual assault and break-and-enter charges, a sentence that under Canadian law meant Williams would serve a minimum of 25 years before any parole consideration, with the realistic prospect that parole would never be granted given the nature and scope of his crimes. Following the sentencing, Williams was stripped of his rank, his medals, and his commission by the Canadian Forces in a formal process that involved the physical destruction of his uniforms and the removal of his name from the institutional records of CFB Trenton in every way that was procedurally possible. His military pilot's wings were melted down. The ceremony of degradation, as formal military processes of this kind are sometimes described, was understood by the Canadian Forces as a necessary institutional statement that the values Williams had publicly represented throughout his career were antithetical to what he had privately been, and that the institution needed to perform its rejection of him in terms as complete and unambiguous as possible. His wife Mary Elizabeth Harriman, a senior executive with the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, divorced him promptly after his conviction, a woman who maintained throughout the proceedings and afterward that she had had no knowledge of her husband's secret life, a claim that investigators accepted as credible based on the evidence available to them, finding no indication that Harriman had been aware of the break-ins, the assaults, or the murders that had been conducted in parallel with the marriage she believed she had. The couple's Ottawa home was sold. The Tweed cottage was sold. The institutional and personal architecture of Russell Williams' public life was dismantled piece by piece in the months following his conviction, as Canada attempted to process the reality of what had been hidden inside one of its most trusted and decorated military officers. Williams was transferred to Millhaven Institution, a maximum security federal penitentiary in Bath, Ontario, where he remains as of the most recently available information, serving his life sentence in a facility that houses some of Canada's most dangerous offenders. He has been eligible for parole consideration since 2035 under the terms of his sentence, though legal observers and corrections specialists have consistently assessed the probability of parole being granted as extremely low given the nature of his crimes and the evidence of the methodical, prolonged, and predatory pattern of behavior that produced them. The broader impact of the Williams case on Canadian society, on the Canadian Forces, and on the communities most directly affected by his crimes has been extensive and enduring. CFB Trenton underwent a significant institutional reckoning in the aftermath of the case, examining the personnel screening and monitoring processes that had failed to identify any indication of Williams' criminal behavior during his years of service and his rise to command. The case contributed to policy discussions in Canada about security clearance processes, psychological screening for senior military appointments, and the systemic conditions that can allow individuals in high-trust institutional roles to conduct extended criminal behavior without detection. Number 7. Larry Hall, the soft-spoken Civil War reenactor who traveled the backroads of the American Midwest living a hidden life of predatory violence that investigators believe claimed far more victims than the law was ever able to formally prove. Larry Dwayne Hall was born on November 9, 1962, in Wabash, Indiana, the identical twin brother of Gary Hall, in a working-class family that settled in the small town of Perrysburg, Ohio, where the boys grew up together in circumstances that those who knew the family described as modest but stable, a household without obvious indicators of the kind of severe dysfunction that true crime narratives often invoke as explanatory context for the violence that follows. Larry and Gary Hall were, by the accounts of childhood acquaintances and family members who were interviewed by investigators and journalists in the years following Larry's conviction, an inseparable pair who shared not only their physical appearance but many of their interests and social habits, including a deepening fascination with the American Civil War that began in their teenage years and that would become, for Larry in particular, something closer to an all-consuming identity than a simple hobby. The twins were quiet, socially awkward, and not well integrated into the broader social world of their peers, young men who existed somewhat at the margins of the ordinary social hierarchies of small-town Ohio adolescence without the kind of visible distress or behavioral disruption that might have drawn professional attention or intervention. They were, to the adults around them, simply a pair of shy, somewhat unusual boys who kept to themselves and were deeply interested in history, and there was nothing in that description that suggested anything other than the ordinary eccentricity of young men who have found a passion that sets them apart from their peers without threatening anyone around them. The Civil War reenactment community that Larry Hall became increasingly embedded in as he moved into adulthood was, and remains, a large and diverse subculture of history enthusiasts who dedicate significant time, money, and energy to the accurate recreation of Civil War battles, encampments, and military life, traveling to historical sites across the eastern and midwestern United States to participate in organized events that can draw thousands of participants and spectators. For Hall, reenactment was more than a hobby and more than a community. It was the framework around which he organized his entire existence, the identity he inhabited most fully and most comfortably, the context in which the social awkwardness and marginality that characterized his interactions in ordinary civilian life were neutralized by the shared obsession and the period costume that placed everyone in the same historical remove from the present. He was a dedicated and knowledgeable reenactor who accumulated an extensive collection of period-accurate uniforms, weapons, and equipment, and who was known within the community as serious and committed, a man who brought genuine historical knowledge and physical authenticity to his participation in events. He worked variously as a janitor and in other low-skill employment that provided him with the economic minimum necessary to sustain his reenactment activities and the extensive travel they required, driving a van across the rural roads of Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and neighboring states to attend events at historical sites and battlefields that dotted the landscape of the American Midwest. It was this travel, conducted alone in a van over years and across hundreds of miles of rural roads, that investigators would eventually identify as the operational framework within which Hall's predatory behavior had been conducted, the reenactment schedule providing both the cover and the mobility that his crimes required. The case that brought Larry Hall to the attention of federal investigators began with the disappearance of 15-year-old Jessica Roach, who vanished on September 8, 1993, from Georgetown, Illinois, a small community in Vermilion County in the eastern part of the state. Jessica was last seen by friends in Georgetown on the evening of September 8, and when she failed to return home that night, her family reported her missing to local authorities. The investigation into her disappearance was handled initially by local law enforcement, who developed few leads in the immediate aftermath and whose investigation was hampered by the absence of witnesses, physical evidence at any identifiable scene, and the kind of forensic resources that the investigation would eventually require to move forward. Jessica Roach's disappearance joined the inventory of unsolved missing persons cases that accumulated through the 1990s in the rural communities of the American Midwest, cases that individually generated local concern and investigative effort but that were not, in the early years of the decade, systematically connected to each other or analyzed for the patterns that might have pointed toward a common perpetrator earlier in the timeline. The connection between Jessica Roach's disappearance and Larry Hall came through a combination of investigative persistence and a piece of physical evidence that proved to be the thread that eventually began to unravel the full picture of what Hall had been doing. A witness in Georgetown recalled seeing a van in the area where Jessica Roach had last been seen on the evening of her disappearance, and the description of the van was consistent with the vehicle Hall drove for his reenactment travel. Investigators developed Hall as a person of interest and identified him as a Civil War reenactor from Perrysburg, Ohio, who had attended a reenactment event in the region around the time of Jessica's disappearance, a geographical and temporal coincidence that placed him in the area and that, combined with the van description, justified bringing him in for questioning. When investigators from the FBI and Illinois law enforcement interviewed Hall in late 1994, more than a year after Jessica Roach's disappearance, they encountered a man who was socially awkward, verbally halting, and apparently unable to maintain the kind of consistent, coherent narrative that innocent people generally produce when accounting for their whereabouts during specific periods. Hall provided investigators with an account of his movements that contained internal inconsistencies and that could not be fully corroborated, and his demeanor during the interview produced the kind of investigative instinct in experienced agents that is difficult to quantify but that experienced investigators describe as the recognition that the person sitting across from them is not telling the truth. During the course of the interview process, Hall made a series of statements that investigators characterized as admissions, acknowledging at various points that he had been in Georgetown around the time of Jessica's disappearance, that he had had contact with a young woman matching her description, and providing details about what had happened to her that only the person responsible for her disappearance could have known. The admissions were not a clean, unequivocal confession, and they were surrounded by retractions, qualifications, and apparent confusion that the defense would later argue reflected the suggestibility and cognitive limitations of a man who was intellectually vulnerable and who had been led by sophisticated interrogators into making statements that did not reflect genuine memory of actual events. This argument about the reliability of Hall's statements became the central legal battleground of the case and one of the most extensively examined questions in the subsequent legal proceedings, a question that went directly to the heart of whether Hall was a predatory killer making calculated admissions calibrated to reveal just enough to satisfy investigators without providing the kind of complete confession that would eliminate all legal maneuverability, or whether he was a troubled, suggestible man who had been manipulated into false admissions by investigators who were convinced of his guilt and who conducted their interviews in ways that produced the answers they were looking for regardless of their truth. Jessica Roach's body was discovered in January 1994 in a field in Vermilion County, Illinois, approximately 4 months after her disappearance, in a rural location consistent with disposal by someone traveling the back roads of the region. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, and the physical evidence recovered with the body was examined for connections to a perpetrator, though the extended period between death and discovery had degraded much of the forensic material that might otherwise have been available. The recovery of her body transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation and intensified the pressure on the investigation to produce an arrest and a prosecution. Hall was arrested and charged with Jessica Roach's kidnapping and murder, and the federal dimension of the case, based on the transportation of a victim across state lines, brought the FBI into the prosecution as the lead agency, a jurisdictional involvement that shaped the legal strategy and the resources available to both sides of the proceedings. The trial of Larry Hall was held in federal court in the Southern District of Illinois, with the prosecution built primarily around the statements Hall had made during his interrogation, the circumstantial evidence placing him in the Georgetown area at the relevant time, and expert testimony regarding the behavioral and forensic aspects of the case. The defense challenged the admissibility and the reliability of Hall's statements vigorously, presenting expert testimony on false confessions and the particular vulnerability of individuals with certain cognitive and psychological profiles to producing inaccurate statements under interrogation pressure, arguing that Hall's intellectual limitations and social vulnerability made him precisely the kind of subject who could be led to make incriminating statements without those statements, reflecting genuine memory or genuine culpability. The jury, after deliberating, returned a guilty verdict on the kidnapping charge, finding that the evidence was sufficient to establish that Hall had abducted Jessica Roach. Hall was sentenced to life in prison by the federal district court, a sentence that prosecutors argued was appropriate given both the severity of the crime and the broader pattern of behavior that the investigation had begun to reveal, a pattern that extended far beyond the single case that had been charged. The conviction was appealed, and the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals undertook a detailed review of the case that produced one of the most extensively analyzed federal appellate opinions in the history of false confession jurisprudence. The appeals court examined the interrogation techniques used by investigators, the cognitive and psychological profile of Hall as established by defense experts, the specific content of the statements Hall had made, and the broader evidentiary foundation of the conviction. In a divided opinion, the Seventh Circuit ultimately affirmed the conviction, finding that the evidence, including Hall's statements, was sufficient to support the jury's verdict and that the trial court had not committed reversible error in admitting the challenged statements. The affirmance of the conviction meant that Hall's life sentence stood, and he was committed to federal custody where he remains today, held at a federal correctional institution, his appeals having been exhausted through the federal system without producing the reversal his attorneys sought. The dimension of the Larry Hall case that has generated the most sustained investigative and journalistic attention in the decades since his conviction is not the Jessica Roach case itself but the broader question of how many other victims Hall may have taken during his years of solo travel through the rural Midwest. Investigators who worked the Hall case developed strong suspicions, based on the geographic analysis of his reenactment travel schedule, the pattern of unsolved disappearances of young women in the regions he traveled through, and the behavioral and forensic indicators associated with his known crime, that Jessica Roach was not his only victim but rather the one case in which the evidence had reached the threshold required for prosecution. The FBI's investigation identified a number of other unsolved disappearances of young women in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois that occurred in proximity to reenactment events Hall had attended, and agents interviewed Hall repeatedly over the years following his conviction in an effort to develop information about these potential additional victims. Interviews in which Hall was by turns cooperative and evasive, sometimes providing information that seemed to lead toward resolution and then qualifying or retracting it in ways that left investigators without the clarity they needed. One of the most significant of these potential additional cases involved the disappearance of Tricia Reitler, a 19-year-old student at Indiana Wesleyan University in Marion, Indiana, who vanished on March 26, 1993, approximately 6 months before Jessica Roach's disappearance, from the campus of her university in circumstances that shared significant behavioral similarities with the Roach case. Hall was identified as a person of interest in Reitler's disappearance through the same geographic and circumstantial analysis that had connected him to Roach, and investigators conducted extensive interviews with him about Reitler over the years following his conviction, interviews in which Hall at various points made statements suggesting knowledge of what had happened to her without ever providing the complete, verifiable account that would have allowed investigators to close the case with certainty. Tricia Reitler's remains were never found, and her case remains officially unsolved, one of the most painful open wounds in a case that has produced many. Her family has spent decades in the particular anguish of not knowing, a form of grief that the criminal justice system's resolution of the Jessica Roach case did nothing to relieve, because the resolution of one case without answers in another leaves families in a legal and emotional limbo that no verdict in a separate proceeding can address. The broader investigative picture that emerged from the analysis of Hall's movements and the pattern of unsolved disappearances associated with his travel routes suggested to the investigators most familiar with the case that the true scope of his predatory behavior was substantially larger than the single conviction would indicate, with some investigators expressing the belief that Hall's victims numbered in the double digits, spread across multiple states and multiple years, each crime conducted in the same operational framework of solo travel in a van through rural areas, the reenactment schedule providing the cover, the mobility, and the plausible geographical explanation for his presence in dozens of communities where young women had vanished. This belief, while widely held among the law enforcement community that worked the case, was never translated into additional charges or convictions, the evidentiary threshold for prosecution in each potential case remaining beyond what the available evidence could establish with the certainty required by law. Hall remains in federal custody serving his life sentence for the kidnapping of Jessica Roach, the only charge ever formally resolved against him, while the families of other young women whose disappearances may be connected to his travels continue to live with the absence of the answers that only Hall himself could provide and that he has, across decades of interviews and investigation, chosen not to give in any form complete enough to bring resolution. The Larry Hall case occupies a distinctive and troubling place in the landscape of American serial predator cases precisely because of its incompleteness, because the legal resolution that was achieved, a life sentence for a single kidnapping conviction, sits alongside the overwhelming investigative conviction that the true scope of Hall's crimes was far greater, creating a gap between what the law was able to establish and what investigators believe actually happened that speaks to the structural limitations of a criminal justice system built on evidentiary standards that protect the innocent but that sometimes also protect the guilty. The reenactment community through which Hall moved for years, and which provided him with both his identity and his operational cover, was itself left to grapple with the revelation that one of its members had been using the shared passion for history as the vehicle for a predatory violence that was as far removed from the commemorative spirit of the community as anything imaginable. Gary Hall, Larry's identical twin brother, has maintained over the years that his brother is innocent of the crimes attributed to him, a loyalty that mirrors the physical bond of their twinship and that speaks to the particular anguish of being the identical counterpart of a man whom the law and the weight of investigative evidence have identified as a predatory killer. Jessica Roach was 15 years old when she was taken from a street in Georgetown, Illinois, on a September evening in 1993. She deserved better than the world gave her, and the full truth of what happened to her, and to the other young women whose disappearances may share her story, remains locked inside a man who has chosen silence over the reckoning that truth would require. Number 8. Herb Baumeister, the seemingly respectable Indianapolis businessman and father who buried the evidence of his secret predatory life in the sprawling grounds of his family estate while his wife and children lived beside the dead. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, the son of a physician father and a mother who provided the family with a comfortable, professionally rooted, middle-class existence in one of Indiana's most established residential communities. From the earliest years of his life, those who knew Herb Baumeister recognized something fundamentally unusual in his behavior and his psychology, something that did not fit neatly into the categories of ordinary childhood eccentricity and that suggested, to the adults perceptive enough to notice, that the boy developing inside the comfortable Indianapolis household was operating according to an internal logic that was not quite aligned with the social and emotional expectations of the world around him. As a child, Baumeister exhibited behaviors that his family and later investigators identified as early indicators of significant psychological disturbance, including an incident in which he was reported to have urinated on a teacher's desk at school, and a deeply disturbing episode in which he was found playing with a human skull he had obtained from his father's medical connections, carrying it around and interacting with it as though it were an ordinary object rather than human remains. Behavior that spoke to an absence of the emotional and moral frameworks that typically govern the relationship between children and death. These early episodes were noted, addressed in the immediate term, and then absorbed into the ongoing narrative of a family that was, in most respects, functioning normally and that did not pursue the kind of sustained professional intervention that might have produced a clearer picture of what was developing inside their son. Baumeister's adolescence and young adulthood were marked by escalating psychological instability that eventually produced a formal psychiatric diagnosis, though the nature and severity of that diagnosis and its implications for his long-term trajectory were not, in the judgment of the professionals who treated him, sufficient to prevent him from pursuing an ordinary adult life. He attended Indiana University, where his behavior was erratic enough to attract attention and concern, and he was at some point during this period diagnosed with schizophrenia, a diagnosis that some later analysts questioned as insufficiently precise or accurate in capturing the full complexity of his psychological profile, but that was the framework within which his treatment was conducted during the years when intervention might have made a difference. He worked for the Indiana Bureau of Motor Vehicles after college, where he met Julie Sater, a woman who would become his wife and who, in the years immediately following their introduction, encountered a version of Herb Baumeister that was charming, engaging, and apparently capable of the kind of sustained reciprocal relationship that his earlier history might have suggested would be beyond him. They married in 1971, and over the following years built a life together that included 3 children, Ryan, Marie, and Eric, and the gradual construction of the domestic and professional structures that would define the public face of Herb Baumeister for the 2 decades that followed. The professional centerpiece of Baumeister's public life was Save-A-Lot Thrift Stores, a chain of resale shops he and Julie established and operated in the Indianapolis area during the 1980s, a business that grew successfully enough to provide the family with a comfortable income and the kind of community standing that comes from visible entrepreneurial achievement in a city that values self-made business success. The stores were legitimate, reasonably well-regarded operations that gave Baumeister a professional identity and a daily routine that placed him in regular contact with customers, employees, and the broader Indianapolis business community, all of whom knew him as a somewhat eccentric but fundamentally ordinary businessman navigating the ordinary challenges of retail entrepreneurship. He was by some accounts a difficult employer and an erratic manager, prone to mood swings and unconventional behavior that created tension in the workplace, but these qualities, while notable, were within the range of what people in his professional circle were willing to accommodate given that the business itself was functioning and that Baumeister's more unusual qualities had not yet produced any consequence serious enough to trigger alarm. The professional success funded the most significant acquisition of Baumeister's adult life, the purchase in 1991 of Fox Hollow Farm, a sprawling 18-acre estate in Hamilton County, just north of Indianapolis in the affluent suburban community of Westfield, a property that featured a large main house, extensive wooded grounds, a swimming pool, and the kind of secluded, private outdoor space that would prove, in ways that the family did not yet know, to be the defining physical feature of everything that followed. Fox Hollow Farm became the home of the Baumeister family and the backdrop against which Herb Baumeister's hidden life was conducted with an impunity that lasted for years. The property's size, its wooded areas, its privacy, and its remove from the immediate scrutiny of neighbors made it an ideal location for a man who needed space to conduct activities that could not survive observation, and Baumeister used the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm in precisely the way that the investigation would eventually reveal, as the location where he brought the men he targeted, where he killed them, and where he disposed of their remains. The victims were gay men whom Baumeister encountered in the bars and cruising areas of Indianapolis that served the city's gay community during the late 1980s and early 1990s, a community that was, like gay communities in many American cities during this period, navigating the devastating impact of the AIDS crisis while also contending with the social marginalization and limited law enforcement engagement that made its members particularly vulnerable to predatory violence. Baumeister was not himself publicly identified as gay and maintained the appearance of a heterosexual marriage and family life, but investigators who later examined his case concluded that he was conducting a hidden sexual life that included contact with men in Indianapolis gay social spaces, a secret that he protected with the same compartmentalization that protected his crimes and that was known, if at all, only to the men he encountered in those spaces and subsequently murdered. The investigation that ultimately led to the exposure of what had been happening at Fox Hollow Farm began not with the discovery of physical evidence but with the accounts of survivors, men who had encountered Herb Baumeister and lived to describe the experience. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department had been receiving missing persons reports involving gay men from the Indianapolis area since the late 1980s, reports that individually received the limited investigative attention that missing persons cases involving adult gay men typically received in that era, cases that were often initially assumed to reflect voluntary departure rather than foul play and that did not generate the sustained investigative resources that might have identified a pattern earlier. It was the accumulation of these reports, and the growing concern within the Indianapolis gay community about the disappearances of men who had last been seen in specific social venues, that eventually brought the pattern to the attention of investigators in a more systematic way. A survivor, a man who identified himself to investigators as Tony Harris, came forward in 1994 with an account of a deeply disturbing encounter with a man he had met at a gay bar in Indianapolis. A man who had invited him to a private estate north of the city, where Harris had been subjected to what he described as a terrifying experience involving autoerotic asphyxiation that had gone to a point where he genuinely feared for his life before he managed to extricate himself and leave. Harris described the property he had visited and provided investigators with enough detail about his host that investigators were able to identify Herb Baumeister as the man Harris had encountered, and the investigation shifted from a diffuse inquiry into multiple missing persons cases to a focused examination of a specific individual whose property, investigators now suspected, might hold evidence of what had happened to the men who had disappeared. The challenge investigators faced in translating their suspicion into legally actionable steps was substantial, because the evidence they had at this stage consisted primarily of Harris's account, which established concerning behavior but not murder, and the circumstantial connection between Baumeister and the missing men that was suggestive but not sufficient on its own for the search warrant that would be required to examine the Fox Hollow Farm property. Detective Mary Wilson of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was among the investigators most persistently focused on the case, working to build the evidentiary foundation required for a warrant while simultaneously attempting to develop additional information from the gay community about encounters with Baumeister and about the missing men whose cases might be connected to him. The investigation was complicated by Julie Baumeister, who was initially resistant to the suggestion that her husband was involved in anything criminal and who declined to consent to a voluntary search of the Fox Hollow Farm property when investigators approached her, a refusal that was legally her right but that extended the period during which the evidence at the farm remained unexamined while investigators worked to establish the probable cause required for a warrant. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1994 through the Baumeister family's own son, 13-year-old Eric Baumeister, who told his mother that he had found a human skull in the wooded area of the Fox Hollow Farm property while playing on the grounds. Julie Baumeister's initial response to this discovery, according to the accounts that emerged later, reflected the same resistance to confronting what the evidence suggested that had characterized her earlier interactions with investigators. She mentioned the skull to Herb, who told her it was a medical skeleton he had obtained from his father, an explanation that Julie accepted, at least outwardly, as sufficient. The skull was not immediately reported to law enforcement, but the information eventually reached investigators, and combined with the other elements of the case they had been assembling, it provided the probable cause foundation they needed. In the summer of 1996, investigators obtained consent from Julie Baumeister to search the Fox Hollow Farm property while Herb was away on a trip, consent that she gave after the relationship between the investigators and the family had evolved through the preceding months of inquiry in ways that ultimately led her to cooperate with the search she had previously declined to authorize. What investigators found during the search of the Fox Hollow Farm grounds in July 1996 was, by the accounts of those who conducted the search, one of the most disturbing crime scene discoveries in Indiana law enforcement history. Scattered across the wooded areas of the 18-acre property, partially buried and partially exposed by weathering and animal activity, were the skeletal remains of multiple individuals, bones distributed across an area that reflected years of disposal activity rather than a single concentrated burial site. The recovery operation, which required weeks of systematic excavation and forensic examination of the grounds, eventually produced the partial or complete skeletal remains of 11 individuals, remains that were examined by forensic anthropologists who were able to establish basic biological profiles including sex, approximate age, and, in some cases, height. Profiles that were then compared against the missing persons cases that investigators had accumulated in connection with the disappearances of gay men from Indianapolis and surrounding areas. The identification process was complicated by the fragmented and incomplete nature of many of the remains and by the extended period over which decomposition had occurred, factors that prevented positive identification in every case but that allowed investigators to establish connections between the recovered remains and specific missing persons in a number of instances. Herb Baumeister was not at Fox Hollow Farm when the search began. He had traveled to Canada, ostensibly on a recreational trip, and as investigators began to understand the dimensions of what they were finding on his property, law enforcement in both countries were alerted to his location and his status. Baumeister was aware, through communications with Julie, that investigators were searching the farm, and the knowledge of what the search would find was something he understood with a clarity that precluded any realistic possibility of the kind of public denial and legal defense that some individuals in his situation attempt to mount. On July 3, 1996, before any arrest warrant had been formally issued and before investigators had formally notified him that charges were imminent, Herb Baumeister died by suicide in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada, shooting himself in a remote area of the park in a death that was discovered and confirmed by Canadian authorities. He was 49 years old. He left a suicide note that addressed his family and spoke of financial and marital difficulties, a document that investigators and analysts noted made no reference to the investigation, the remains on his property, or the 11 men whose bones lay in the woods at Fox Hollow Farm, an omission that spoke either to a final act of calculated self-protection or to a psychological compartmentalization so complete that he genuinely experienced his own death primarily in the framework of the domestic and financial pressures that were real but utterly secondary to the criminal reality investigators had uncovered. The death of Herb Baumeister before any charges were filed created a legal situation in which the criminal justice system's normal processes of prosecution, trial, and formal verdict were unavailable, a situation that left the families of his victims in the particular anguish of having no courtroom resolution, no formally rendered verdict, no sentencing proceeding in which the impact of his crimes on their lives could be formally acknowledged by the institutions whose function it is to provide. That acknowledgement. There was no trial. There was no conviction. There was only the evidence on the ground at Fox Hollow Farm, the forensic analysis that connected that evidence to a pattern of predatory violence, and the death of the man responsible in a Canadian park before the law could compel him to account for what he had done. The investigation remained technically open in the sense that 11 sets of remains required formal identification and that the full scope of Baumeister's crimes, in terms of both victim count and geographic range, was never definitively established. Some investigators who worked the case expressed the belief that the 11 identified sets of remains at Fox Hollow Farm represented only a portion of Baumeister's actual victims, that the operational pattern of targeting isolated gay men in Indianapolis social spaces had been running long enough and had claimed enough victims that the total number was likely higher than what the property search had revealed. A belief that the available evidence supported in its circumstantial dimensions but that could not be confirmed given that Baumeister had taken whatever complete knowledge he possessed with him to the park in Ontario. Julie Baumeister cooperated fully with investigators following the search and her husband's death, providing whatever information she had about his activities, his movements, and the property to assist in the investigation and the identification effort. She maintained that she had not known about the murders, that the marriage she had experienced had not revealed to her the secret life that the investigation exposed, and investigators concluded that the evidence available to them was consistent with that claim, finding no indication of her involvement in or knowledge of the crimes. She and her children left Fox Hollow Farm, which was subsequently sold, the property eventually changing hands multiple times as the notoriety of its history made sustained occupancy difficult and the practical reality of what lay in its soil made the grounds themselves a permanent monument to the crimes committed there. The estate has in subsequent years become a location of morbid historical interest, a property whose address and history are known to true crime enthusiasts and whose current status has been the subject of ongoing attention from the community that has followed the case. The Indianapolis gay community, which bore the direct human cost of Baumeister's predatory targeting, was left to reckon with both the specific losses documented by the investigation and the broader systemic failure that had allowed those losses to accumulate for years without generating the investigative response that might have ended them sooner. A reckoning that contributed to sustained advocacy for more equitable and attentive law enforcement engagement with missing persons cases involving gay men and other communities that had historically received less institutional attention than their circumstances warranted. The Baumeister case stands as one of the most disturbing examples in American criminal history of the way in which the structural features of a predator's life, in this case a large private estate, a respected business, a conventional family, and the targeting of a community whose disappearances were systematically underprioritized by law enforcement, can combine to provide the operational space and the temporal freedom required for sustained predatory violence to continue far longer than it. 11 confirmed victims. An unknown potential number of additional ones. A family that lived beside the evidence for years. A community that mourned its missing without knowing why they were gone. And a man who died in a Canadian park without ever being required to stand before a court, face his victims' families, or account in any formal legal sense for what he had done in the woods of Fox Hollow Farm. The bones recovered from that property in the summer of 1996 are the permanent record of what Herb Baumeister was beneath the thrift store owner, the husband, the father, the resident of an 18-acre estate in one of Indianapolis' most comfortable suburban communities, and they speak with a clarity that no trial verdict could have exceeded about the distance between the life he showed the world and the life he was actually living in the woods behind his house. Number 9, Juan Corona, the labor contractor and community figure who concealed the murders of 25 migrant farm workers in the peach orchards and riverbanks of rural California while the men who trusted him with their livelihoods disappeared into the earth beneath his feet. Juan Vallejo Corona was born on February 7, 1934, in Autlán, Jalisco, Mexico, one of many children in a large, impoverished family whose circumstances reflected the grinding agricultural poverty of rural Mexico in the early 20th century, a poverty that shaped the decisions and trajectories of millions of Mexican men and women during the decades of the mid-century when the economic pull of California's agricultural economy drew a steady and desperate stream of labor northward across the border and into the fields and orchards of the Central Valley and the Sacramento Valley, where the demand for cheap, mobile, compliant labor was essentially limitless and where the men and women who provided that labor existed in conditions of economic and social vulnerability that left them almost entirely outside the protections that American law nominally provided to everyone within its borders. Corona crossed into the United States in 1950 at the age of 16, joining the flow of bracero and undocumented workers who were making the same crossing during those years, drawn by the wages available in California agriculture and by the network of family and community connections that guided Mexican workers toward the specific regions and employers where work was available. He settled in the Yuba City area of Sutter County in Northern California, a region dominated by peach orchards and other fruit agriculture that depended heavily on migrant labor for the seasonal harvesting operations that were the economic foundation of the local farming economy. Corona worked the fields, developed relationships within the Mexican-American agricultural labor community of the region, and over the following years established himself with a permanence and a degree of economic success that set him apart from the seasonal migrants who passed through the valley and moved on. The pivotal event in Juan Corona's early California life was a severe psychological break that occurred in 1956, when Corona was 22 years old and had been in the United States for 6 years. He suffered what was diagnosed as a schizophrenic episode of sufficient severity to require hospitalization, and he was admitted to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, where he received treatment including electroconvulsive therapy, a standard intervention for severe psychiatric episodes in that era whose efficacy and long-term effects were understood far less comprehensively than they are today. Corona was hospitalized for approximately 3 months before being released and returning to Yuba City, a release that was authorized by the treating physicians on the basis of their assessment that his acute episode had resolved and that he was stable enough to return to community life, an assessment that subsequent events would suggest was either incorrect or that failed to account adequately for the conditions under which his stability was likely to be maintained. The hospitalization and diagnosis were documented in his medical records and were known to the authorities responsible for his immigration status, but they did not result in deportation or in any form of ongoing monitoring that would have tracked his mental health status in the years that followed. Corona returned to Yuba City, resumed his life in the agricultural labor community, and within a few years had established a labor contracting business that would become both the economic foundation of his family's life and the operational framework for the crimes he would eventually commit. Labor contracting in California's agricultural economy occupied a specific and powerful structural position in the relationship between farm owners and the migrant workers whose labor made the farms productive. A labor contractor served as the intermediary between farmers who needed workers for specific tasks and the pool of available laborers, recruiting workers, organizing their transportation to job sites, managing their compensation, and providing the logistical infrastructure that allowed seasonal agricultural operations to function. For the workers themselves, particularly those who were undocumented, who did not speak English, who were new to the region, or who had no independent network of employment contacts, the labor contractor was a figure of significant power, a person whose goodwill determined whether they worked and ate or did not, whose word about employment conditions and wages was effectively unchallengeable by men who had no alternative framework within which to evaluate it, and whose practical control over the daily circumstances of workers' lives extended far beyond the formal economic relationship of employer and employee. Juan Corona built a successful labor contracting operation in Sutter County over the course of the 1960s, developing relationships with the ranch owners and farm operators who hired his crews and establishing a reputation as a reliable supplier of labor who could be counted on to deliver workers when they were needed and to manage them effectively in the field. He married, fathered children, and constructed the domestic and professional life of a man who had found a secure and productive place in the agricultural economy of his adopted country, a life that those who knew him in his professional and community roles described as ordinary and unremarkable in the ways that matter most to the people around you. The victims of Juan Corona's murders were men drawn from the most vulnerable population in one of California's most economically marginalized communities, transient male farm workers, many of them older, many of them alcoholic, many of them without stable housing or reliable social connections, men who traveled the agricultural circuits of Northern California following the harvest seasons and who existed in a social and institutional margin that made their disappearances unlikely to generate immediate alarm or sustained investigative attention. These were men who moved frequently, who had no fixed addresses, who communicated irregularly if at all with family members who were often in Mexico or in other states, and whose absence from any particular location could easily be explained, by anyone who did not look closely, as simply the next move in the constant migration that defined their working lives. Corona encountered many of these men in the labor pools and agricultural camps around Yuba City, and the murders are believed to have occurred over a period beginning in early 1971, though the precise timeline was difficult to establish with certainty given the condition of many of the victims when they were eventually discovered and the absence of any surviving witnesses to the killings themselves. The crimes came to light not through a tip, a witness account, or a forensic breakthrough but through a chance discovery that initiated one of the largest forensic excavation operations in California history to that point. On May 19, 1971, a Japanese-American farmer named Goro Kagehiro discovered a freshly dug hole in one of his peach orchards near Yuba City and reported it to the Sutter County Sheriff's Department, concerned about the unexplained disturbance in his orchard. Deputies who responded to investigate the report found, upon closer examination of the disturbed soil, evidence that the hole was not simply an unexplained excavation but a burial site, and the investigation that followed the discovery of the first grave expanded with a speed and a scope that reflected the growing understanding of what investigators were dealing with as they worked through the orchard and surrounding areas. The excavation operation that Sutter County Sheriff Roy Whitaker organized in response to the initial discovery was a massive undertaking that drew resources from multiple law enforcement agencies and that proceeded through the late spring and early summer of 1971 with a mounting sense among the investigators involved that the scale of what they were uncovering was unlike anything that had previously been encountered in California criminal history. The orchards and riverbanks of Sutter County yielded grave after grave, each containing the remains of a man who had been killed by a combination of stabbing and sharp force trauma to the head, injuries inflicted with weapons that forensic analysts identified as consistent with a machete and a meat hook, tools associated with agricultural labor and with the specific work of the labor crews that operated in the orchards. Each grave contained, in addition to the victim's remains, a specific set of artifacts that became the most critical physical evidence connecting the murders to a single perpetrator, receipts and other paper documents bearing the name of Juan Corona, found in multiple graves in circumstances that could not be explained by coincidence or by any innocent account of how those documents had come to be buried with the dead men. The receipts, some of which related to Corona's labor contracting business, were found in the graves in a pattern so consistent across multiple burial sites that investigators immediately recognized them as the signature of a single offender and as the direct physical link between that offender and the crimes. Juan Corona was arrested on June 4, 1971, less than 3 weeks after the discovery of the first grave, after the recovery of 25 bodies from the Orchard and Riverbank burial sites, and after the forensic analysis of the receipts and other documents found in the graves had provided investigators with the probable cause required for an arrest. He was taken into custody at his home in Yuba City in the presence of his family, a moment that shattered the domestic and professional life he had built over 2 decades in Sutter County and that initiated a legal proceeding of extraordinary complexity and duration that would consume years of the California criminal justice system's time and resources. The initial investigation was led by Sutter County Sheriff's detectives working in conjunction with the California Department of Justice, and the evidence they assembled in the weeks following Corona's arrest was, in its physical dimensions, among the most extensive and varied bodies of material evidence in any California murder case to that point, encompassing the remains and associated artifacts from 25 separate burial sites, forensic analysis of blood and other biological material found in Corona's butcher shop and his vehicles, witness testimony from individuals who had seen Corona with some of the victims in the days before their disappearances, and the documentary evidence that connected him directly to the burial sites. The trial of Juan Corona, which began in September 1972 in Yuba City before Judge Richard Patton and ran for more than 5 months before concluding in January 1973, was one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in California history to that point, a proceeding whose complexity reflected both the number of victims, 25 separate murder counts requiring individual evidentiary foundations, and the legal and logistical challenges of a case of this scale. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Dave Teja, who presented a methodical case built on the physical evidence from the graves, the forensic analysis connecting Corona to the crime scenes and to the victims, and the testimony of witnesses who placed Corona with specific victims near the time of their deaths. The defense, led by attorney Richard Hawk, challenged the evidentiary connections between Corona and the murders, suggested that the crimes had been committed by another individual, specifically pointing toward Corona's half-brother Natividad Corona, who had a documented history of violence including a stabbing incident at a cafe he operated, and argued that the documentary evidence found in the graves had been planted by investigators or had arrived there through innocent means unconnected to the murders. The defense also raised questions about Corona's mental competency, invoking his 1956 psychiatric hospitalization and arguing that his mental health history was relevant to both his culpability and his capacity to stand trial, arguments that required extensive psychiatric evaluation and that added additional complexity to proceedings that were already legally and logistically demanding. The jury, after deliberating for 45 hours over a period of several days, returned guilty verdicts on all 25 counts of first-degree murder on January 18, 1973. Juan Corona was sentenced to 25 consecutive life terms, a sentence that under California law as it existed in 1973 meant that he would be subject to the parole review processes that applied to life-sentenced prisoners in the California system, a legal framework that would produce, in the years following his conviction, a series of parole hearings that generated renewed public attention to the case each time they occurred. The conviction was appealed, and in 1978 the California Court of Appeal overturned the conviction on the grounds that Corona's trial attorney had provided inadequate representation. Juan Corona has appeared before California's Board of Parole hearings multiple times in the decades since his second conviction, each appearance generating public attention and opposition from victim advocates, law enforcement representatives, and members of the communities affected by his crimes. He suffered a serious assault by another inmate at Soledad State Prison in 1973, an attack that left him blind in one eye, and his physical health has been a recurring consideration in parole proceedings, with defense advocates arguing at various points that his age and health condition warranted compassionate consideration and with prosecutors and victim advocates arguing consistently and successfully that the nature and scope of his crimes precluded any release that was not compelled by the legal requirements of the parole system. As of the most recently available information, Juan Corona remains incarcerated in the California state prison system, now in his 90s, the oldest surviving defendant in one of the most consequential agricultural labor cases in American criminal history. A man whose crimes against the most vulnerable men in California's farm labor economy exposed the specific dangers created by the intersection of economic dependency, social marginalization, and the trust that workers with no alternatives were compelled to place in the labor contractors who controlled their access to work, wages, and shelter. The legacy of the Juan Corona case extends well beyond the criminal proceedings themselves and into the broader history of California agriculture, labor rights, and the treatment of migrant workers. The 25 men who were killed in the orchards and riverbanks of Sutter County were men whose lives had been defined by displacement, poverty, and the specific vulnerability of the undocumented and transient worker in an economy that needed their labor but provided them with minimal legal protection and minimal social support. Many of them were identified only through the painstaking forensic and investigative work that followed the discovery of the graves, their identities reconstructed from physical evidence, documents found at burial sites, and the recollections of people who had known them in the labor camps and agricultural communities of Northern California. Some were identified quickly through documents found on their persons or in the graves. Others required more extensive investigation. The full identification of all 25 victims was a process that extended over months and that required cooperation between California investigators and Mexican authorities, given that many of the victims had family connections in Mexico that needed to be traced and notified. The families who received the news of their relative's death, often months after the actual killing, were families who had been living with an absence they had perhaps explained to themselves as the ordinary silence of a man moving through the agricultural circuits of a country far from home, and who had to absorb the truth of what had actually happened alongside the knowledge that the man who had employed and trusted their relative had been the one who killed him. The Juan Corona case accelerated conversations already underway in California about the structural conditions of agricultural labor and the specific vulnerabilities created by the labor contracting system, conversations that contributed to legislative and regulatory changes in California's agricultural labor law during the 1970s. A period that also saw the continuing growth of the United Farm Workers movement under Cesar Chavez and the broader transformation of California's approach to the rights and protections owed to the men and women who harvested its crops. The case demonstrated with terrible clarity that the social invisibility of migrant farm workers, the conditions that made their disappearances easy to overlook and their deaths easy to conceal, was not simply a neutral feature of the agricultural labor system but a condition that created specific and deadly risks for the most economically powerless participants in that system. Risks that the law and the institutions responsible for public safety had an obligation to take more seriously than they had historically done. 25 men went into the ground in the orchards of Sutter County because one man understood the invisibility that their circumstances had given them and used it with a deliberateness and a duration that speaks to both the depth of his predatory intent and the completeness of the structural failures that enabled him to act on it for as long as he did before a Japanese-American farmer noticed a hole in his orchard and called the sheriff. Number 10, Robert Durst, the troubled heir to one of New York's most powerful real estate dynasties whose life became a decades-long trail of suspicious deaths, calculated deceptions, and extraordinary escapes from justice that finally ended in a Los Angeles courtroom more than 40 years after the first person in his life vanished. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, in New York City, the eldest son of Seymour Durst and Bernice Hirsch Durst, the first generation of what would become one of the most powerful and wealthy real estate families in the history of New York City. The Durst Organization, the family enterprise that Seymour built and that would eventually own and manage some of the most significant commercial real estate in Manhattan, including One Bryant Park and numerous other landmark properties, represented a level of wealth and institutional power that placed the Durst family in the uppermost tier of New York's economic and social hierarchy, a position that carried with it both extraordinary privilege and the specific psychological pressures that attend the expectation of succession in a dynasty built on one man's vision and ambition. Robert Durst grew up in Scarsdale, New York, in the kind of comfortable suburban affluence that the Durst family's wealth provided, attending private schools and moving through the social world of New York's upper class with the ease that money and family name conferred on those born into their circle. The event that those who later examined Durst's psychology most consistently identified as the formative trauma of his development occurred when he was 7 years old, in 1950, when his mother Bernice fell to her death from the roof of the family's Scarsdale home. Robert was present in the house when his mother died, and the circumstances of her death, whether she fell accidentally, jumped, or was in some other way involved in a death that was officially ruled accidental but that carried around it the permanent ambiguity that attaches to unexplained falls from rooftops, were never definitively established and were something that Robert Durst would carry with him for the rest of his life as the originating wound around which every subsequent relationship and every subsequent loss would organize itself in ways that psychiatrists and analysts who later examined him could identify but never fully resolve. Durst attended Lehigh University and later the University of California, Los Angeles, where he studied economics, and he moved through his 20s and early 30s in the elongated adolescence that great inherited wealth sometimes produces, a man who had not yet been required by circumstances to fully commit to any particular direction or identity, sustained by the family fortune while the question of his role in the Durst organization remained unresolved and while his personal life developed along lines that were, to those who knew him during this period, more notable for their intensity than their stability. He met Kathleen "Kathy" McCormick in 1971, a young woman from a working-class background on Long Island who was studying to become a nurse and who, by the accounts of friends and family who knew her during her relationship with Durst, was warm, vivacious, and deeply in love with the complicated, intellectually intense man she had met. A man whose wealth and social position represented a world very different from the one she had grown up in and whose personal qualities, both attractive and troubling, she navigated with the optimism and energy that characterized her engagement with everything in her life. Robert and Kathy married in 1973, and the couple settled into a life divided between New York City and a weekend home in South Salem in Westchester County, a life that from the outside bore the markers of the privileged domestic existence that Durst's background made available but that, according to the accounts of Kathy's friends and family who eventually spoke publicly about their observations, was characterized by a controlling dynamic and episodes of behavior from Robert that generated genuine concern among those who cared about Kathy's well-being. The disappearance of Kathy Durst on the night of January 31, 1982, is the event from which every subsequent chapter of Robert Durst's extraordinary criminal history flows, the originating disappearance that established the pattern of loss, evasion, and institutional non-accountability that would define the next 4 decades of his life. On that Sunday night, Robert Durst told investigators and acquaintances that he had driven Kathy to the train station in Katna, New York, to catch a late train back to New York City, where she had medical school classes the following morning, and that he had last seen her alive as she boarded that train. Kathy never arrived at her classes. She never contacted her friends or her family. She was never seen alive again. The investigation into her disappearance was handled by the New York State Police and by the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and in those early months and years of the investigation, Robert Durst was the primary and essentially the only person of interest, the husband who had last seen her, who had provided an account of that last contact that could not be corroborated, and who, as investigators began to examine the dynamics of the marriage more closely, appeared to have had both opportunity and potential motive for whatever had happened to his wife. Durst retained prominent legal counsel, cooperated selectively with investigators in ways that provided information without creating legal exposure, and navigated the investigation with a combination of the legal protection his wealth could buy and the psychological detachment that seemed to characterize his relationship to the losses and the questions that accumulated around him. Kathy Durst was declared legally dead in 2017, 35 years after her disappearance, a declaration that followed decades during which the case had remained officially open and periodically active without producing the evidence required for a criminal charge. In the years immediately following Kathy's disappearance, Robert Durst's life continued in ways that his wealth and his family's institutional power made possible regardless of the cloud of suspicion that the investigation had generated. He eventually stepped back from his expected role in the Durst organization after his father Seymour chose his younger brother Douglas to lead the company rather than Robert, a decision that represented a rejection of a deeply personal and professionally consequential kind, and that those who analyzed Durst's psychology identified as a significant source of the bitterness and instability that characterized his behavior in the years that followed. He remarried in 1988 to a woman named Deborah Lee Sheraton, a New York real estate broker, a marriage that was by most accounts unconventional in its structure and that provided Durst with a domestic and legal partnership that would prove significant in the legal proceedings that eventually came. The second death connected to Robert Durst was that of Susan Berman, a woman who had been one of his closest friends since their days together at UCLA in the 1960s, the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster named Davy Berman, whose colorful biography Susan had written, and a writer and socialite who moved through the New York and Los Angeles worlds with the energy and ambition that had defined her since childhood. Susan Berman had been a crucial figure in the aftermath of Kathy Durst's disappearance, providing Robert Durst with what she described as an alibi of sorts, speaking to investigators and journalists in ways that supported his account and that helped manage the public and investigative narrative around the case in the critical early period after Kathy vanished. What investigators eventually established, through evidence developed decades after the fact, was that Berman had direct knowledge of what Durst had done to Kathy, knowledge that made her not merely a loyal friend who had stood by him in a difficult time but a person with material information about a crime who had chosen to protect the perpetrator rather than the victim. This knowledge, and the specific way in which it made Berman a potential witness against Durst if the Kathy case were ever seriously reinvestigated, provided what prosecutors would eventually argue was the motive for what happened to her on December 23, 2000. Susan Berman was found shot to death in her Benedict Canyon home in Los Angeles on December 24, 2000, a single gunshot wound to the back of her head, an execution-style killing that detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department immediately recognized as a professional or quasi-professional act rather than a robbery or a crime of passion. A note had been sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department that directed them to Berman's address and identified the location as the site of a cadaver, a note written in block letters that became one of the most analyzed pieces of handwriting evidence in the case's long subsequent legal history. The LAPD investigation into Berman's murder identified Durst as a person of interest from an early stage, given his history with the Kathy disappearance and his close friendship with Berman, but the investigation initially stalled without sufficient evidence to support a charge, and Durst moved through the period following Berman's death with the same pattern of legal insulation and investigative non-cooperation that had characterized his engagement with the Kathy case nearly 20 years earlier. The third death connected to Robert Durst was in many ways the most bizarre and the most legally consequential in the short term, even though it was also the case that ultimately resulted in the outcome that most confounded those who believed justice would be straightforwardly served. In 2001, Durst was living in Galveston, Texas, where he had retreated from New York in the aftermath of the renewed media attention generated by the reopening of the Kathy case investigation, living under the assumed identity of a mute woman named Dorothy Sina, renting a room in a boarding house and existing in a deliberately reduced and hidden social profile that represented one of the most extraordinary acts of voluntary self-concealment by a wealthy individual in modern American criminal history. His neighbor in the Galveston boarding house was a 71-year-old man named Morris Black, and on September 28, 2001, Morris Black was found dead in Galveston Bay, his body dismembered, his limbs distributed in garbage bags that had been weighted and thrown into the water, his head never recovered. Robert Durst was identified as the suspect almost immediately, arrested in October 2001 after being connected to the dismembered remains through a remarkably straightforward chain of physical evidence, and charged with murder in the death of Morris Black. What followed was one of the most astonishing jury verdicts in American criminal history. Durst, represented by a skilled Texas defense team, admitted at trial that he had killed Morris Black and had dismembered his body, but argued that the killing had been an accident resulting from a struggle over a gun that Black had pointed at him, and that the subsequent dismemberment, which he acknowledged and described in detail, had been an act of panic rather than premeditation. The defense argued that the act of dismembering a body and distributing the parts in a bay, while undeniably disturbing and criminal in its own right, did not establish that the initial killing had been anything other than a defensive act in the circumstances Durst described. The Galveston jury, after deliberating, acquitted Robert Durst of murder in November 2003, convicting him only of the lesser charge of evidence tampering for the dismemberment and disposal of the body, a verdict that sent shockwaves through the legal community and that generated enormous public debate about the adequacy of the Texas criminal justice system's handling of the case and about the degree to which Durst's wealth and the quality of the legal representation it had purchased had influenced an outcome that seemed to many observers to be inconsistent with the evidence. Durst was sentenced to 5 years for the evidence tampering conviction, and given credit for time served and his bond forfeiture, he was effectively free within months of the verdict, walking out of the Galveston legal proceedings with an acquittal for murder in his pocket and returning to a life that his wealth continued to make possible regardless of the accumulating history of deaths and disappearances that surrounded him. The development that ultimately brought Robert Durst to a final accounting with the legal system was not a breakthrough in any of the 3 cases that had defined his criminal history but a documentary film, a fact that itself speaks to the extraordinary and unprecedented nature of the case's final chapter. In 2010, Robert Durst agreed to participate in a documentary project being developed by filmmaker Andrew Uretsky, who had previously made a film called All Good Things that was loosely based on the Durst story and that had starring Ryan Gosling as a fictionalized version of Durst. Durst agreed to a series of filmed interviews with Uretsky that were conducted over several years and that eventually formed the basis of a 6-part documentary series called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, which HBO broadcast in February and March of 2015. The documentary was a sensation, generating enormous public and media attention and culminating in a final episode that contained what became one of the most dramatic moments in the history of true crime documentary filmmaking. During the filming, Uretsky and his team had obtained a letter that Durst had written to Susan Berman, a letter whose handwriting investigators compared to the cadaver note that had been sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department directing them to Berman's body, and the comparison revealed striking similarities that the documentary presented to Durst in the final interview. Durst's reaction to being shown the comparison was visibly disturbed, and at the conclusion of the interview, believing he was off camera and that his microphone had been disconnected, Durst was recorded in the bathroom of the interview location speaking to himself in a murmur that was captured by the still-active microphone, a soliloquy that included the words, delivered in a tone of apparently involuntary self-confrontation, that what he had done was killed them all, of course. The bathroom recording became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Robert Durst for the murder of Susan Berman, and its legal admissibility was one of the most extensively litigated questions in the proceedings that followed. Durst was arrested on March 14, 2015, the day before the final episode of The Jinx was broadcast, in a New Orleans hotel room, arrested on a warrant issued by Los Angeles County for the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. He was extradited to California and held without bail as the legal proceedings in the case commenced, proceedings that were delayed by multiple factors including Durst's health issues, the complexity of the evidence, and the interruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which shut down California courts for extended periods beginning in 2020 and significantly extended the timeline of a prosecution that had already been years in development. The trial of Robert Durst for the murder of Susan Berman finally began in earnest in 2020 before Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Mark Windham, with Deputy District Attorney John Lewin leading the prosecution and a defense team that mounted a vigorous challenge to the admissibility and interpretation of the key evidence, including the bathroom recording, the handwriting comparisons, and the broader pattern of conduct that the prosecution argued demonstrated Durst's guilt. The prosecution's case was built on multiple converging lines of evidence. The handwriting expert testimony established that the cadaver note sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department after Berman's death was written by the same person who had written the letter Durst had sent to Berman, a person the prosecution argued was Durst. The prosecution presented evidence that Durst had traveled to Los Angeles in the days before Berman's murder and had been in the vicinity of her home around the time of her death, evidence developed through cell phone records, travel documents, and witness accounts that collectively established his presence in Los Angeles during the relevant period. The prosecution argued that Durst had killed Berman because the renewed investigation into Kathy Durst's disappearance, which had been intensified following the broadcast of a television documentary about the case in 2000, had created a risk that Berman, as a person with direct knowledge of what had happened to Kathy, would be called as a witness in any prosecution that resulted, a risk that Durst had eliminated by killing her before she could testify. The bathroom recording, which the court ultimately ruled admissible after extensive legal argument about the circumstances of its creation, was presented to the jury as evidence of consciousness of guilt that, combined with the other evidence in the case, established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On September 17, 2021, after deliberating for 8 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Susan Berman, finding that Durst had killed her with deliberation and premeditation and that the killing had been a calculated act designed to protect himself from the legal exposure that Berman's knowledge represented. The verdict was received by those who had followed the case for decades as a moment of profound, if partial and long-delayed, justice, a recognition that the pattern of deaths and disappearances that had defined Robert Durst's life since Kathy's disappearance in 1982 had not been coincidence, had not been misfortune, and had not been the result of circumstances beyond his control, but had been the product of deliberate choices made by a man whose wealth had insulated him from accountability. For 4 decades. Judge Mark Windham sentenced Robert Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole on October 14, 2021, a sentence that the judge delivered with language that made clear the court's understanding of the full scope of Durst's moral culpability, even as the legal proceedings addressed only the one murder for which he had been charged and convicted. Durst was also charged in Westchester County, New York, with the second-degree murder of Kathy Durst, charges filed in November 2021 that would theoretically have required him to face a second murder trial for the crime that had initiated the entire sequence, but those proceedings never reached trial. Robert Durst died on January 10, 2022, at the age of 78, at a hospital in Stockton, California, where he had been transferred from custody for medical treatment related to the serious health conditions, including bladder cancer and a history of other medical issues, that had complicated the final years of his legal proceedings. He died approximately 3 months after being sentenced to life without parole for Susan Berman's murder, having never faced trial for Kathy's death, having never been charged with Morris Black's murder despite his admitted dismemberment of the body, and having never been required by any legal proceeding to give a full and honest account of the trail of deaths and disappearances that ran through his life like a thread pulling everything apart. The families of Kathy Durst and Susan Berman, and the community of people who had known and loved them, were left with the complicated and incomplete resolution that the legal system had been able to deliver. A single murder conviction arrived at 40 years late, a life sentence served for less than 3 months before the convicted man died in a hospital bed, and the permanent open question of everything that the evidence suggested but that the law could never fully prove. The Durst case stands as one of the most extraordinary examples in American legal history of the relationship between extreme wealth and the capacity to evade accountability, a case that traced across 4 decades the ways in which money, legal representation, social position, and the specific vulnerabilities of the investigative and prosecutorial systems that were brought to bear on it combined to allow a man who left a trail of deaths through his life to remain free for as long as he did. It also stands as a testament to the persistence of the investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who refused to let the case dissolve into the institutional amnesia that wealth and time can produce in equal measure, who continued to examine, investigate, and present the evidence even when the legal system seemed unable or unwilling to act on it, and who ultimately contributed to the verdict that, however partial and however delayed, represented the only formal legal acknowledgement that the world ever produced of what Robert Durst had done. Kathy Durst deserved better than to vanish from a train station in 1982 and spend the next 40 years as an open case in a filing cabinet. Susan Berman deserved better than to be shot in the back of the head in her own home on the night before Christmas Eve by the man she had protected for 20 years. And the world that Robert Durst moved through for 8 decades, insulated by his family's wealth from the accountability that applies to everyone else, deserved to know, finally and formally, what the man behind the real estate dynasty and the documentary cameras and the bathroom soliloquy actually was.